Chapter 113. It was a simple and heartwarming breakfast. When Soren brought little Vivian downstairs, Gloria also happened to come out at the same time. She glanced at the little girl next to her, and her lips moved slightly but no sound came out. Only a sentence rang in Soren's ears: "Vivian had a nightmare last night again." Soren nodded silently and his face was dignified, but he did not speak. This was already the third time. As time passed, the signs that Vivian was the child of God became more and more obvious. The frequency of her nightmares also increased, and the interval between the last two nightmares was even shorter. Although the little girl often smiled and did not say anything, Soren knew that she must have guessed something. Vivian had been very smart since she was a child. Although she did not like to show it, she was definitely not a simple and obedient little girl. Most of the time she was smarter and sharper than Soren, but it was not obvious because of her age. After all, she was only 8 years old this year. When they went downstairs, the halfling's figure had just come in from outside the door. There were obvious wet marks on his feet, and it seemed that he had been outside. Aladdin quietly walked to Soren's side, found a stool and sat down. Then he whispered, "Last night the elven patrol was attacked. It seemed that it was done by war-creatures who believed in the god of the hunt, but I couldn't find out what kind of war-creatures did it. The elven patrol was very angry, and it seemed that they were going to contact the other patrol teams." War-creatures. They mainly referred to humanoid creatures such as gnolls, taurens, lion-faced people, centaurs, tiger-headed monsters, half-shepherds, harpies, sirens, and so on. These creatures had some obvious human characteristics, and some obvious beast characteristics. It was said that they were the product of some taboo experiments during the Arcane Empire. Some of them were ancient life forms that had existed for a long time, and most of them were scattered around the world. There was also an intelligent life form, the orcs. They were the same kind of life form as humans, but they were not a type of war creatures. Malor, the god of the hunt? Soren frowned and paused for a moment before asking in a low voice, "Are you sure it was its followers that attacked the elves?" Aladdin nodded with certainty. "I'm very sure. Looks like trouble." Soren raised his head and looked at Gloria. Suddenly, he said to the halfling beside him, "We're going to leave soon. Do you want to continue traveling with us, or do you have other plans?" "Leaving so suddenly?" The halfling looked at Soren with some astonishment. Gloria, who was next to him, also raised her head in surprise. Aladdin was still puzzled, but the Northern Witch took a deep look at Soren and nodded gently, "Yes. We'll continue our journey to the Frost Kingdom." The halfling showed a troubled expression and whispered, "Why are we going so far away? It's cold there, isn't it?" The door of the hotel was pushed open. A gloomy elven guard walked in. He glanced around the hotel, and his eyes stopped on Soren for a moment before he closed the door and left. There were no followers of the god of the hunt in this hotel. Soren quickly stood up, looked at Gloria and said, "Pack your things, we'll leave soon." The halfling was obviously in a dilemma. He stood in place and thought for a long time before he whispered, "I don't plan to go so far away. Let's part ways here. Come find me in the Shire when you have time. I'll treat you to a big meal." Soren smiled and replied, "Okay. You'd better not get involved in this matter. The followers of the god of the hunt are crazy." Obviously. Soren held back his curiosity and did not go down last night. However, the halfling could not hold back his curiosity and went to investigate. They soon decided to leave. Vivian followed them very quietly, and Gloria did not ask much. Only the halfling stayed in place, watching them leave with some pity. The halfling and the witch in front of him must have a story, and the little girl was not simple either. Her talent was undoubtedly very strong. Although rogues were not very clear about the talent of wizards, in the halfling's view, Vivian was undoubtedly an excellent talent for wizards. He hesitated and looked at the location of the temple. In the end, he remembered Soren's warning and did not get involved in this matter. Soren was right, the followers of the god of the hunt were indeed a little crazy. They walked all the way to a very far place. When Soren put Vivian down to rest, Gloria came over with a dignified expression and asked in a deep voice, "Why did you leave so suddenly?" It seemed that she trusted Soren a lot. She did not ask until now. Soren glanced at the village behind him, then slowly said, "The god of the hunt should also be asleep. As a relatively weak god, once he sleeps, it is possible that the followers and priests will not be able to obtain divine spells. I guess this attack is a hunting ritual." The Northern Witch's knowledge was undoubtedly very rich. She looked at Soren hesitantly and murmured, "You mean this attack may be for the legendary blood?" Soren nodded silently and said in a deep voice, "The god of the hunt is only interested in legendary hunting rituals. The god of the hunt, Malor. It was a primitive god with weak divine power. It was also known as the king of beasts, the beast of black blood. It was a chaotic and evil god. It liked bloody killings and ruthless hunting rituals. The more powerful the target was, the easier it was to attract its attention. His body was a creature that looked like an ape but had a ferocious face. He had black hair and blood-red skin. His face was somewhat like that of an orc, but his appearance was more ugly and ferocious. Many gods were not human or human-like creatures. Some were purely intelligent beasts. The god of the hunt, Malor, was such a god. He was a rare monster that became a god for some reason. His followers were mainly evil war creatures, hunters who enjoyed hunting, people who liked blood, and some fallen rangers like Droll. This was the easiest god to awaken. He had a strong desire for legendary blood. As long as the target was legendary or above, it was possible to attract his avatar. There were many war creature groups nearby that believed in the god of the hunt. Soren estimated that there was at least a 50% chance that the war creatures were holding some kind of ritual. In the legendary blood hunting ritual, the war creatures would also hunt a large number of ordinary creatures to pave the way. Malor was a very strange god. He liked to hunt powerful targets. The more powerful the prey, the easier it was to attract his attention. If it was just killing ordinary creatures, he would not even care at all. This kind of legendary hunting ritual could strengthen his divine power. In order to please this evil god, his followers would try to hunt legendary targets every once in a while. At first it was wild beasts. Later, even intelligent creatures were included in the list. The Northern Witch took a deep look into the distance and said in a low voice, "There's a red copper dragon nearby. Could it be that it's the target?" Legendary creatures. Dragons were undoubtedly the most standard legendary creatures. Soren also thought for a moment. He looked at the other party and said, "It's not that easy to kill a dragon. If it's not necessary, Malor's followers would not try to kill a dragon." Creatures of the chaotic evil alignment were more crazy. Malor's followers were some very crazy guys. Soren could not determine their goal and did not want to have too much interaction with them. In the dense virgin forest, a dark knoll was leaping between the trees. It was different from the knoll Soren had seen before. This knoll was more agile and more dangerous. Its pupils were green, and its figure was like a phantom shuttling through the forest. It often flew past in a flash, and it was difficult to catch its trace with the naked eye. It was wearing some kind of leather armor sewn from the skin of some kind of black beast. There were no weapons on its body, but at the position of its claws, one could see the cold light of steel. Its claws were actually replaced with metal by some kind of special method. Patter. The knoll, whose level could not be determined, landed. It looked to the side with its green eyes and said in a deep voice, "The ritual is about to begin. We must awaken the attention of the god of the hunt. Without the protection of the gods, the tribe will become weaker and weaker, and our prey will become fewer and fewer." Heavy footsteps were heard. It was a mixed-blood orc with a very strong physique that looked like a little giant. Its face was ferocious and its fangs were exposed. It glanced at the knoll in front of it and said, "The ritual requires legendary-level prey. I know there is a red copper dragon nearby, but it seems that we can't kill it with our strength." The knoll showed a grim smile. There was a metal tooth on its right side. It said, "There is no need to kill the dragon. I know there is a son of fear nearby. The blood of these sons of fear will definitely attract the attention of the Lord more than the dragon." Son of fear? The mixed-blood orc looked around. There were many strange creatures around it. The followers of the god of the hunt were very complicated. There were humans, orcs, and even intelligent beasts as well as dark creatures that enjoyed hunting. The black gnoll looked at the others and said in a deep voice, "I have seen him use his divine power. It seems that he has just awakened. Some of you go and prepare other sacrifices. The rest of you follow me to track the prey. I believe that using a son of fear as a sacrifice will definitely awaken Malor's attention." Strong figures flew out. These hunters, whose strength was conservative and above grade 3, spread out. Accompanied by all kinds of strange howls, they quickly scattered into the dense forest. The knoll raised its metal claws and scratched its face with the sharp claws. Drops of blood dripped down the side of its face. The other creatures that stayed behind did the same. The strong mixed-blood orc cut its forehead with a blade, then knelt down on one knee and began to pray. There was a devout and crazy smile on its face. The hunting ritual. At this moment it really began. Chapter 114. They were next to a clean rock. Soren was sitting next to them chewing on dried meat. Gloria didn't seem to have a good appetite, so she only ate a little and put it down. The northern witches were of noble birth, so they didn't like this kind of inferior food. She would only eat some snacks and drink some water in the wild. Vivian wasn't picky at all. Whether it was a delicious meal or a tasteless dry food, the little girl could eat it with relish. She even raised her little white hand to wipe Soren's mouth. "Who is it?" Soren's hand that was holding the dry food suddenly paused. He jumped up in an instant, pulled out his curved sword and shouted towards the distant woods, "Who is it? Come out quickly. Otherwise don't blame me for being rude." Gloria also reacted very quickly. She instantly took out a staff from her multi-dimensional bag, and the gems that stored spells on it slightly glowed. Vivian's small body stood behind Soren, and there seemed to be some doubt on her face. She looked up at the woods not far away, and her expression was difficult to describe with words. She also seemed to be a little confused. "Sorry." A magnetic voice sounded, and then a very handsome elven ranger came out. He was so eye-catching just by standing there. If Soren's appearance with a trace of half-elf blood was relatively handsome, then compared to the elven ranger in front of them, he was even worse than an ordinary person. With just a glance, both men and women would be affected by his handsome appearance for a while. He was like the protagonist of a story in a tavern. Even if it was just a glance, he could make noble ladies blush and their hearts beat faster. This was an extremely handsome elven ranger. Even Soren couldn't describe his handsome appearance with words. He could only say that he was favored by the elven gods. Gloria's eyes lit up for a moment, and then she slightly frowned. The northern witches still retained the characteristics of the northerners. They appreciated the strong with perseverance. The elven ranger in front of them was too handsome, so handsome that it felt a little surreal. The elven ranger landed lightly on the ground and jumped down from the tree. He glanced at Soren's face, then glanced at Gloria and finally stopped at Vivian who was behind her. He said, "I don't mean any harm. I'm just passing by." Soren didn't relax at all. He said in a deep voice, "Then please leave." The elven ranger did not leave immediately. He smiled and looked very friendly. He took a step forward and said, "Don't be so nervous. I'm a ranger who believes in the god of nature." "Stop." Soren's expression was still serious as he said in a low voice, "We don't know you, please leave this place." The elven ranger's stiff eyebrows slightly wrinkled. He glanced at Soren, then turned his eyes to Gloria. He showed a charming smile and slowly said, "Dear lady, your companion doesn't seem to be very friendly to me. I think he may have misunderstood me. I just happened to pass by. It's very dangerous to travel alone in the wilderness. Maybe we can travel together. Where are you going?" Gloria gently lifted her long hair. The veil on her face prevented him from seeing her expression. He only heard her slowly say, "Back off, stranger." At this moment, Vivian suddenly pulled Soren's clothes with her small hand and whispered, "Brother, this person looks very familiar, but I don't think I've seen him before." The little girl had a very good memory. She could remember most of the people she met. The elven ranger in front of her had very good hearing. He seemed to have heard Vivian's words. He grabbed his head and showed a kind smile, then said softly, "Hello, lovely little girl. You also give me a familiar feeling. Maybe we've met before." Soren and Gloria looked at each other in an instant, and the alert look on their faces became more dignified. Although the elven ranger in front of them looked very handsome and had a harmless smile, the two of them didn't feel that he was friendly at all. When they first met the halfling, Aladdin was standing on the side of the road. When he saw them, he even jumped up and waved at them. At a glance, they knew that he didn't have any hostility. But the elven ranger in front of them was different. He had obviously snuck up on them. He only showed himself when Soren noticed him. His seemingly friendly smile was probably just a disguise. His acting skills must be very good. The elven ranger didn't seem to think that he would encounter such a situation. With his incomparably handsome appearance and friendly smile, he rarely attracted any hostility from others. However, the two people in front of him looked like they were ready to fight at any time. No matter how handsome or friendly his smile was, it couldn't change the other party's attitude. If he had directly walked over, Soren wouldn't be so hostile. However, the elven ranger was quietly hiding nearby and only showed up after being discovered. This was very strange. Vivian gently wrinkled her nose and whispered, "Brother, let him go." The three of them didn't like him very much. The elven ranger's expression was a little stiff, but he still forced a smile and then retreated into the forest. When he turned around, his face instantly became gloomy. He did pass by because he accidentally discovered them. He seemed to have sensed something and approached them. At first, he just wanted to observe them quietly. However, he didn't expect to be discovered by Soren as soon as he sneaked over. This was a very powerful rogue. The Elven Ranger's stealth ability was also very strong. The fact that he was discovered in an instant only proved that the other party was much more experienced in stealth than him. He didn't know how Soren discovered him, but to be able to discover him, he was definitely a first-class rogue. Soren held his curved sword tightly. After making sure that the Elven Ranger had really left, he nodded and said in a deep voice, "Let's move on. There was something wrong with that Elven Ranger just now." Gloria looked into the distance and immediately cast Lighten. Soren carried Vivian on his back, and the three of them continued to move forward. Those who were proficient in stealth would naturally be able to discover signs of stealth. In order to hide from Soren's perception, one would need at least 150 points in stealth. Although the Elven Ranger was also proficient in stealth, he couldn't be compared to a professional rogue. If it was the halfling Aladdin, Soren wouldn't be able to discover him so easily. This was the territory of the elves. It was normal to encounter Elven Rangers here. Soren carried Vivian on his back and continued to move forward. Gloria seemed to have something on her mind along the way, and she would look back from time to time. "What's wrong?" Soren noticed her abnormality and asked, "Is there something wrong?" Gloria was silent for a moment. Then her lips moved slightly and she used a level 0 communication spell and said, "That Elven Ranger just now looked a little like Vivian. He also seemed to have something different about him. And he was too handsome, he didn't look like an elf at all." These were the words that entered Soren's ears, but her voice was, "Nothing. I just wanted to see if that Elven Ranger was following us." Elves were very handsome. But the Elven Ranger just now was not only handsome, his appearance could even affect the attitude of others. It was like some creatures with the talent of charm. If you approached them, you would have to go through a test of will. Otherwise, you would be affected. Soren was about to say something, but suddenly there was a dull roar behind him. It sounded a little like the roar of an orc, which had a unique wild nature. Soren swallowed the words he wanted to say and prepared for battle in an instant. Gloria also cast a defensive spell with a dignified expression, and then pulled Vivian behind her. Whoa! The howl of the gnolls was heard, and it was like a sign, and all kinds of howls could be heard from all directions. These sounds were very mixed, and Soren even heard the low roar of a cheetah. The sound was not far from where they were, and they could vaguely hear the roar of battle, and all kinds of howls that were gradually approaching. Not good. Soren's expression changed slightly, and he pulled Gloria up and said, "It seems to be a believer of the god of hunting, let's go." Chapter 115. Howls and howls could be heard. A figure could be seen leaping through the trees in the distance, followed by a few other dark figures. The roars of the beastmen were getting closer and closer. Soren carried Vivian on his back and prepared to retreat. Gloria also quickly cast a spell, but the monsters in all directions seemed to have noticed them. They could vaguely see a few strong figures jumping down from the trees, planning to go around and block them. One of the figures was very eye-catching. It was a large black cheetah. A mutated beast. Some special beasts had mutated genes, possibly related to the forbidden experiments of the Arcane Empire. They had appeared in large numbers for a period of time, but many of them were hunted down and killed. The remaining ones escaped to the astral plane and the outer realms. Some of the beasts in the material plane had inherited these mutated genes. When a creature's level reached a certain level, it was possible for them to mutate. These beasts had spell-like abilities, but they were very rare. Most of them only had high intelligence and powerful hunting abilities. These beasts were said to be the failed products of the war creature experiment. Soren stopped and handed Vivian to Gloria. The black cheetah in front of them was very difficult to deal with. Its body was almost the size of a Siberian tiger, and its elegant body had obvious muscle contours. It was like a bodybuilding champion among beasts. This meant that the cheetah was very strong. It was even stronger than a brown bear, and its claws could tear through armor. The cheetah's speed was very scary. Soren didn't dare to continue running, because it would be exposing his back to the cheetah. In short-distance sprinting, almost no creature could surpass this mutated cheetah. In the wilderness, cheetahs were more dangerous than tigers because it was basically impossible to outrun them on land. Against such creatures, if you tried to run away, they would only pounce on you in an instant, and then mercilessly tear your throat out. Soren took a deep breath as he sprinted. His muscles tensed and he jumped 10 meters or so. He swung his curved sword and slashed at the cheetah's head. The beast had no protection, and its hide alone couldn't stop his attack. It was a light leap. The large black panther nimbly dodged his attack. At the same time, its face revealed an anthropomorphic mocking smile. This beast's intelligence was higher than expected. Its creature level might have reached grade 3 or above, but it was still too careless. Soren raised his finger and shot out 2 arcane missiles from his fingertips within a second. No matter how fast the panther was, there was no way it could dodge the attack at such a close distance. The next moment, a small hole was opened in its neck. The 2 arcane missiles had pierced through its skin, leaving a wound about 3 centimeters deep. Blood immediately splashed out. With Soren's spell power, the 2 arcane missiles at such close range dealt at least 20 damage. 1 point of spell power could increase the damage of the arcane missiles by 1 point. A high-grade wizard could easily pierce through armor with arcane missiles. Soren's spell power was also around 10 points. Even if he didn't use vitality, he could still inflict light damage to the target. The wounded cheetah was obviously a bit slow. Soren quickly followed up with a swing of his curved sword, and blood splashed out as he slashed at the cheetah's back. The slash left a wound about 5 centimeters deep. But after breaking through the muscles, he couldn't continue. He could only withdraw his sword and retreat. His vitality reduced the damage taken. 2 points of vitality increased damage reduction by 1 point. Some creatures with strong vitality could even use their muscles to clamp down on weapons. Dragons were the best of the best. Without extraordinary weapons, it would be very difficult to kill a dragon subspecies. Even if one could break its dragon skin, they would not be able to break through its tough muscles, and they would not be able to damage its vital organs. Therefore, it would be very difficult to kill a dragon subspecies with just bleeding damage. Sharp claws slashed through the air. The thick and tough cheetah's tail whipped at Soren, and the wind whistled like a whip. Soren twisted his body to avoid the attack. 3 shallow scratches were left on his arm, and his waist was hit by the tail. But with his vitality he could still withstand it. The other monsters nearby were getting closer and closer. Soren didn't have time to waste. He instantly took out his wooden cane and pointed it at the cheetah in front of him. A flash of light appeared. The weeds on the ground suddenly grew wildly, and they wrapped around the cheetah like tenacious vines. Even if the cheetah had the strength of a large cat, it couldn't break free in a short time. This short 1 or 2 seconds was more than enough for Soren. He jumped onto the cheetah's back and used his strength to push it down. Then he held his curved sword tightly with both hands and slashed down. The power of sword form. Heavy hack exploded in an instant, and the curved sword cut off the cheetah's head. Blood spurted out 3 to 5 meters away. The headless body of the cheetah stiffened for a moment, and then fell to the ground with a thud. A row of data appeared: activated sword form, heavy hack. Activated decapitation. Dealt 125 decapitation damage to the target. Target killed. Extracting soul energy. You've received 2450 slaughter EXP. It was indeed a grade 3 cheetah. The creature's level was estimated to be around level 12. If it wasn't for the surprise attack, it would be more difficult to deal with it than dealing with the earth elementals. Big brother, be careful. Suddenly Vivian's scream came from behind Soren. Gloria also quickly cast a spell in an instant. First, she buffed them with a spell, then raised her hand and shot a blood-red light in front of them. Finger of Death. The sound of the bowstring vibrating could be heard. Soren didn't think much and activated the elemental stone on his body. A yellowish mark on the ground spread to his body. Almost at the same time as the stone skin spell was cast on his body, a sharp arrow flew over and hit him directly in the chest. The force of the arrow caused him to take a step back. Next to the bushes in front of him, a tall and burly orc with a strong bow in his hand locked onto Soren with a ferocious gaze. But in the next moment, its gaze turned into shock. Soren did not fall. The arrow hit his chest, but it was only stuck between his ribs. The arrow should have pierced him directly, but it was offset by stone skin, which reduced the damage by 20 points. In addition, Soren had 20 points of constitution, so although the arrow hit his chest, it did not cause as much damage as expected. He gritted his teeth and pulled out the arrow. The leather armor in front of his chest was pierced. The opponent used a strong bow. The dark red light hit the tall and burly orc in the next moment. Its body stiffened and then it fell straight to the ground. Level 7 spell, Finger of Death. The Finger of Death cast by a high-grade northern, which was not a joke. It was not easy for any profession below grade 4 to pass the test of death. If they couldn't pass the test of death, they would die in an instant. After pulling out the arrow, Soren didn't care about the wound. He swung his sword to block the attack of another mixed-blood orc next to him. The heavy battle axe with ferocious force made his whole body sink. A Knoll mixed-blood creature on the left threw out a short axe and hit Soren's back in the next moment. Clang. The short axe seemed to have hit solid marble. Soren's leather armor was only dented a little, and he almost didn't suffer any damage. The opponent's strength wasn't high, and they probably didn't have special training in throwing weapons. The attack of the short axe didn't exceed 20 points, and it couldn't break through Soren's stone skin. The presence of the northern which attracted most of the hunters' attention. At least more than half of the hunters bypassed Soren and rushed to Gloria and Vivian behind him. Wizards were the most terrifying existences. They must not be given the chance to cast spells. A monster with a ferocious face that even Soren couldn't recognize roared, and its body suddenly began to grow. It then took a deep breath and sprinted on the ground with all 4 limbs. The speed was almost unbelievable. It was a berserk orc. In the face of such a dangerous situation, Gloria was still as calm as ever. She even had the time to pull Vivian behind her. Then she abruptly pulled out her magic staff and pointed it forward. A fireball the size of a wash basin flew out. Its target wasn't the enemy in front of her, but the empty space in front of her. 1 second ago the sprinting monster didn't have time to stop. It was completely inertia. When it rushed over, it just happened to enter the core area of the fireball's explosion. The next second, its whole body was covered in blood and flesh. Its chest was blown to the bone and its hair was burning. Vivian looked carefully. Gloria had an awe-inspiring aura. She was completely different from the one Soren knew. She said in a cold voice, "Do you still remember the movement calculation I taught you? Movement positioning and spell prediction are very important skills. Many enemies are very fast and spells don't have to be aimed at the enemy to be effective." The whistling sound of the wind was heard. 2 flying axes and a long sword were thrown towards the 2 of them. Gloria didn't care at all. She slammed her wand into the ground, and then her hands quickly cast a spell. At the same time she said, "Spell protection field is the foundation of a spellcaster. When fighting you have to make sure that you are covered by the energy protection field at all times." Bang bang bang. The thrown weapons seemed to hit the invisible air, and when they hit the energy protection field they made a muffled sound. Gloria's expression didn't change at all. It seemed that she didn't see the enemies rushing over at all. Focus was the most important basic skill for a spellcaster in a battle. A spellcaster couldn't be distracted and let the enemy interrupt their spellcasting. The skill of focus also made them more sensitive to the changes around them. Shadow tentacles. 6 energy tentacles broke out of the ground and shot out in an instant. Half of the enemies nearby were instantly stunned, and then they were rolled up and hung upside down by the energy tentacles. The shadow tentacles cast by the high-grade witches were completely different from Soren's. The energy tentacles wrapped up and directly strangled 2 enemies, and then all the nearby enemies were dragged back and hung in the air. Only then did Gloria slowly pull out her staff and say in a serious voice, "Vivian, you have to always remember that for a wizard, control is more important than damage." The battlefield was strangely silent for a moment. Everyone, including Soren, also saw the real strength of a high-grade northern witch at this moment. This was the style of a high-grade wizard. Chapter 116. Soren didn't hesitate at all. When the dark tentacles entangled the enemies near Gloria, he quickly pulled out his scimitar and retreated. The scimitar drew a cold light and beheaded the enemies that were entangled by the dark tentacles. Wizards would never be the main damage output. They could only remember a small number of large-scale destructive spells. Even the real damage spells were only single-target fatal spells like Finger of Death. In a battle, the melee professions were always responsible for the last hit. It was better to control the enemy and let the warrior slash them with his scimitar instead of dealing damage. More and more enemies appeared in the vicinity. The number of enemies was completely beyond Soren's estimation. Even Gloria's expression became dignified. She said in a deep voice, "My spell slots can't deal with so many enemies." The number of enemies was more than 100. All of them were creatures above grade 2. They were believers of the god of hunting and were much stronger than the guards of Whiterun. The believers of the gods must have stronger fighting abilities. If the god of hunting hadn't fallen into a deep sleep, perhaps there would have been existences among these monsters that could use divine spells. The power of the weak gods was not enough. They were weakened a lot before the time of troubles. They would only grant divine spells to their core believers and priests. Other believers who were not valued would lose the ability to use divine spells. These monsters held hunting rituals to awaken the gods' attention. As long as they proved their value, the god of hunting might regard them as more useful believers and grant them divine spells. Those worthless believers would be deprived of their divine spells because the power of the god of hunting was also declining. The time of troubles. All the gods' divinity level was declining. When their divinity level was exhausted, they would fall to the mortal world. The weaker the gods, the faster they would fall. Only when the energy storm of the time of troubles was over would they regain their divinity level and return to the kingdom of the gods. The gods who walked in the mortal world were saints. They didn't have divinity levels. They only retained their initial profession level, so some of them were very weak. Some of them relied on luck to ascend to godhood. Their own strength was not very strong. They were only around the high-grade legendary level. They relied on their divinity level to break through to a total level of more than 40. This was why there had been cases of weaker deities killing stronger deities. The reason for this was that after losing their divine cores, the difference in strength between the two parties would not be too great. However, when the gods descended to the mortal world as saints, their average attributes were basically above 25 points. Even without the power brought by the level of divinity, the difference in their attributes could completely crush any mortal. A small number of powerful deities could reach up to 50 points in their attributes. When faced with the goddess of magic who had 50 points of intelligence, even legendary wizards would feel that their spells were like sideshows. Among the abyssal demon gods, they were known for their strength. It was no joke for them to be able to move mountains and fill seas with their bare hands. There were more and more believers of the god of hunting. Soren realized the severity of the situation. Gloria's spell slots could not handle so many enemies. Just as he was about to cover Gloria's escape, a loud howl came from behind. Then the elven ranger rushed out. He looked very embarrassed. There were 7 or 8 bloodstains on his body. His handsome face was torn by sharp claws. He was almost completely disfigured. He was holding a long sword in his hand, and the way he held the sword was very strange. Upon closer inspection, one of his fingers was broken. It seemed that his little finger was bitten off by some beast. When the elven ranger saw Soren and the others, his eyes immediately showed a look of surprise. Then his expression became vicious. He suddenly leaped and left the hunters behind him, who were obviously much stronger. At the same time, he quickly approached them. It turned out that he was the target of the believers of the god of hunting. Behind him, there were obviously more powerful hunters and trackers. A group of monsters gave up on Soren and the others and rushed toward the elven ranger in front of them. This was the most important goal. They must not let the elven ranger in front of them escape. Otherwise, this hunting ritual would be considered a failure. Death's fear. The elven ranger did not make any casting movements, not even a spell. He raised his hand and a light appeared. Then a wave of fear aura exploded among the enemies blocking the way. This was not a divine spell that could be used by high-grade rangers, nor was it an arcane spell cast by wizards. It was a special spell-like ability. It might be a talent that the elven ranger had. A large number of creatures froze in place. Then many of them showed fear on their faces as if something terrible was happening. They fled in panic in all directions. There were even a small number of enemies who turned blue and died on the spot. They were scared to death. The elven ranger scattered the enemies in front of him with fear. Then he suddenly sped up and rushed over, getting closer and closer to Soren. Damn it! Soren's expression was very ugly for a moment. Gloria next to him also looked dignified. Because just a spell-like attack, they were sure of the identity of the elven ranger in front of them. Son of Fear. Other than the son of the Dread Lord, they really could not think of anyone else who could cast fear at will and achieve the effect of scaring the enemy to death. A gnoll whose whole body was dark like a shadow appeared. It stretched out its scarlet tongue and licked the corner of its mouth. Its metal claws flashed a cold light. It grinned and said, "The flesh of the Son of Fear is really extraordinary. I felt an exuberant life force. Maybe after the ritual is completed and we kill him, we can have a good meal ourselves." The majestic hybrid orc strode out of the forest, carrying a giant battle axe that weighed nearly 200 pounds in its hand. It roared, "He is the prey for my lord. After the ritual is completed, we can decide what to do with his body." Soren clenched his curved sword and stared fiercely at the elven ranger who was getting closer and closer. The elven ranger's purpose was very vicious. He actually intended to lead these hunters to them. Soren's murderous intent was very strong. He said, "When he gets close, you find a way to control him. I'll be responsible for killing him." Gloria nodded gently. Her eyes were also full of murderous intent. Killing this guy might make the hunters stop attacking. Even if the possibility was not high, it was worth a try. Besides, this guy was definitely not running towards them with good intentions. The elven ranger was getting closer and closer. but stopped before entering the range of Gloria's spell. He jumped to a high place and then shouted to the believers in all directions, "I'm not the only son of fear. The little girl over there is also a son of fear." "I don't believe it. Look over there." He seemed to have activated some special ability. He raised his hand and pointed in the direction of Soren. A wave of fear aura burst out. Many terrible scenes appeared in Soren's mind. There were mountains of corpses, seas of blood, and piles of bones. There were also all kinds of cruel and horrible scenes. However, how could his will be so easily shaken? It only took a moment for him to suppress this feeling of fear. At the same time, a series of data flashed in front of his eyes. "You are affected by fear aura. Test of will triggered. Successfully passed, death fright. Successfully resisted the effect of fear." Gloria's will was obviously very high. She was only a little startled and quickly recovered. But what everyone did not expect was, Vivian, who was standing behind Gloria, suddenly trembled all over. Then her eyes suddenly widened and her cute little face was pale. Her face seemed to be slightly blue because of fear, as if she was trying to suppress something. When her emotions accumulated to a certain limit, she suddenly let out a very sharp scream. "Ah!" An invisible sound wave spread, and the first to bear the brunt was Soren. His ears were buzzing and traces of blood were oozing out from his eyes, ears, mouth and nose. Then there was Gloria, who was standing next to him. Her face was very pale, as if some kind of spell had been activated. Suddenly, a flash of light protected her in it. Her figure swayed and almost fell to the ground. The terrible sound wave spread out. The nearby Mailer believers fell in batches like wheat being cut down. At least half of them died directly under the sound wave. All the others were bleeding from their 7 orifices, and their figures were obviously shaking. The only ones who were not affected much were the powerful hunters. They were grade 4 professions. This level of attack could only hurt them, but it was not fatal. The Elven Ranger showed a vicious smile on his face and said, "Did you see that? She is also a child of fear. It seems that the 2 people around her are a little weak. The children of fear that have just awakened are very weak. Why don't you kill them first? It should be easier to kill them than to kill me, right?" The Dark Gnoll showed a sneer. After glancing at the prey in front of him, he said with a ferocious expression, "I like your vicious heart. But if we offer 2 children of fear as sacrifices, we will definitely be rewarded by our Lord." An invisible sound wave spread rapidly, and all the beasts within a 5-kilometer radius seemed to be greatly frightened, and all of them frantically fled in all directions. In an ancient cave, a droll who was meditating with his eyes closed suddenly opened his eyes. He slowly stood up. As an elf, he was unusually tall and strong like a solid rock. He walked out of the cave with heavy steps, looked at the chaotic forest in the distance and murmured, "Who scared them?" An eagle fell from the sky. After it landed, it turned into the figure of a droll. It humbly lowered its head and said, "Your Excellency Earthwalker." Farther away, somewhere in a dark underground secret room, the black-robed priest on the altar suddenly opened his eyes. His eyes were shining and he said fanatically, "The first child of fear has awakened. Let the hand of despair go. Find him at all costs." Time froze at this moment. Soren's eyes suddenly became bloodshot. That was because the burst of power in his body made his blood surge. His heart accelerated to the limit in an instant. His kidneys secreted crazily, and the excessive congestion turned his pupils into a blood-red color. His face was a little distorted, and his expression was very ferocious. His originally injured body began to gradually recover. As a large amount of slaughter EXP was consumed, his injuries became lighter and lighter. His figure also became more and more blurred, as if he was about to disappear in the shadows. Behind him, Soren's shadow was distorted. The next moment, he rushed toward the Elven Ranger in front of him, and his figure disappeared out of thin air. The entire material plane also completely lost track of him in this second. Shadow plane travel. P.S. This chapter was written very slowly. It took me a long time to edit it, so the update is half an hour late. 2 updates today, more updates tomorrow. Chapter 117. Everything happened in 1 second. When Soren's figure disappeared into thin air, everything in front of him turned gray. The sky was an eternal gray, even the sunlight and the moonlight were the same color. This 1 second was very short, and Soren's surroundings were rapidly moving backward. His body was assimilated by the shadows in a short period of time and temporarily transformed into the form of a shadow creature. the physical body became illusory. The surrounding scenery was also distorted. Plane travel opened a dimensional passage to the shadow plane, which was a spell-like teleportation ability. It could only be used for a few seconds and it didn't really enter the shadow plane. The next moment he appeared behind the Elven Ranger. The Elven Ranger's shadow twisted strangely. The ferocious shadow turned into a distorted outline, and finally turned into Soren's shadow. Then, a vague figure covered by shadows suddenly appeared. The Elven Ranger still had a vicious smile on his face. Anyway, he had achieved his goal. The hunters had obviously assigned some of their manpower to deal with Soren and Gloria. This way he would be in less danger. As long as the hunters were restrained by the three people next to him, he would have a great chance to escape with his ability. After all, he was also a son of fear. He even began to plan his escape route. He didn't even have time to change the expression on his face. Just like that, his body suddenly stiffened. The sharp tip of the blade pierced through his chest and pierced his heart in an instant. Then, with a loud shout, the blade twisted violently. Die. Soren's expression was ferocious. He held the blade with both hands and twisted it. The blade broke through the Elven Ranger's armor and pierced through his heart. At the same time, it twisted a bloody hole in his chest. A crack appeared on the exquisite military-grade curved sword. This weapon couldn't withstand Soren's sudden burst of strength and showed signs of cracking. The shadow behind him was still twisting. The Elven Ranger's shadow overlapped with his own. His whole person looked gray like a black shadow. When he pulled out the curved sword, the shadow returned to its original appearance, and the blurry face gradually became clear. The Elven Ranger's body fell straight to the ground. In a situation that no one expected, he was directly killed by Soren. The Gnoll's ferocious smile remained stiffly on his face. The other hunters were in disbelief. A bunch of data crazily appeared. Activate Dark Vision. Activate Shadow Hide. Activate Shadow Jump. Activate Shadow Strike. Shadow Hide successful. Ability, Evade Sight, activated. Shadow Jump successful. Activate Cross-Plane Shadow Jump ability. Shadow Strike successful. You received 9 points of shadow damage. Activated Backstab. You have dealt 121 points of fatal damage. Target killed. Extracted Soul Energy of the Soul. You have gained 3,600 Slaughter EXP. Target is a divine creature. Divine Power extracted Divine Power. Receive 3 Divinity. Of the target. Failed. Divinity Storage. Clergy storage of the divinity. You don't have any divine spark or divine domain to store the divine power of fear. Target of the target. Behind the dense jumping data were the data that appeared in the second when Soren exploded. Thief profession has leveled up to level 7. Received 25, DX 20 plus, INT 20 to 10, asterisk 0. 5, skill points, HP increased by 11, profession HP 6 plus, con 20 to 10, asterisk 0. 5. The 11 HP brought about by leveling up temporarily alleviated his injuries. Although his ears were still temporarily deaf, Soren had regained his perception of the outside world. The anger and killing intent in his heart were extremely strong. He did not hesitate to put the Slaughter EXP into it. The Elven Ranger in front of him must die. Such a strong killing intent even made his pupils become blood red because of the expansion of the tiny blood vessels. All the skill points were allocated to evade. Soren reached the requirements to advance into a Shadow Dancer in an instant, and then chose to advance without hesitation. Advance into a Shadow Dancer. Advancement requirements. Reflex evasion, achieved. Flexible movement, achieved. 100 points of sneak, achieved. 50 points of evade, achieved. You have successfully advanced into a Shadow Dancer. Shadow Dancer's ability bonus activated. You have spent an additional 5,000 Slaughter EXP. You have learned the profession talent, Evade Sight. Sneak plus 15, Evade plus 20. HP increased by 13, profession HP 8 plus, con 20 to 10, asterisk 0. 5. You have gained a free attribute point. You have successfully advanced into a grade 3 profession. You have gained the opportunity to purify your bloodline. You have gained an additional ability point. Advancing into a Shadow Dancer cost him more than 13,000 Slaughter EXP. In addition to the extra 5,000 Slaughter EXP, he also needed to pay the soul energy to level up. However, the strength of the advanced profession was also undeniable. Soren lost a skill point allocation from the rogue level, but he gained an additional 10 points of sneak and 20 points of evade. At the same time, he also mastered the most useful ability of the Shadow Dancer: Evade Sight. Evade Sight, Profession Talent. The Shadow Dancer has extraordinary shadow skills. This skill is not comparable to other professions that use shadow abilities. As long as the body is in the shadows, the Shadow Dancer can use shadow energy to confuse the enemy's sight. Under any circumstances, the Shadow Dancer can activate the stealth skill, also in battle. Even if the Shadow Dancer is exposed to the enemy's eyes, the Shadow Dancer can let himself successfully escape into the shadows and disappear from the enemy's sight out of thin air. Level 1 is once a day. There was also a limit to the rogue's stealth ability. It was impossible to directly disappear from the enemy's sight. Stealth was a process of merging oneself into the shadows. This process involved the ubiquitous shadow energy. There were only two kinds of advanced rogues that could disappear in front of your eyes in broad daylight. One was the lurker who mastered Evade Sight, and the other was the Shadow Dancer who mastered Evade Sight. The former directly disappeared into the shadow plane, and the latter used shadow energy to confuse your sight. The lurker was no longer in the material plane in this second of escaping into the shadows. He would temporarily enter the shadow plane and then come back. When he came back, he would have been completely integrated into the shadow energy. The Shadow Dancer used shadow energy to confuse your sight in this second. Although you couldn't see his existence, the Shadow Dancer was still in front of you, and you could still attack him. The Shadow Dancer profession has been upgraded to level 2. Receive 25 DX 20 plus INT 20 to 10, *0. 5, skill points, HP increased by 13, profession HP 8 plus, con 20 to 10, *0. 5. Advanced Profession Talent Comprehension. You have comprehended the profession talent, Dark Vision. The half-elf night vision ability has been superimposed. The total rogue profession level is 9, level 7 Thief, level 2 Shadow Dancer. You have received an additional ability point. 1 rogue level increased his HP by 11 points, and 2 Shadow Dancer levels increased his HP by 26 points. As an advanced combat type profession, the Shadow Dancer had a strong evasion ability, which could improve the efficiency of mastering evasion abilities. At the same time, the profession level was also 2 points higher than the rogue. The basic HP of the rogue was 6, and the basic HP of the Shadow Dancer was 8. It was the same as the basic HP of most agility-based warriors. Abilities had to be trained or obtained by relying on ability points, but profession talents were abilities that could be mastered directly. Talents, as the name implied, were innate abilities. Many talents were special abilities that did not require ability points to master. Talents were basically brought about by advanced professions and innate bloodlines. A total of 37 HP increase. Soren directly recovered a lot from his seriously injured state. His vision had been restored. Although his ears were still bleeding, he could gradually hear. His internal organs that were affected by some kind of supernatural sound wave power quickly recovered. His body that was seriously injured by Vivian's attack had completely recovered. His eyes locked on the Elven Ranger in front of him, and he did not hesitate to upgrade the Shadow Dancer to level 2. In the case of a secondary profession, the secondary profession only counted half of the profession level. Level 7 Thief, level 2 Advanced Shadow Dancer. Soren's rogue level was 9 in total. His secondary profession level 5 Wizard only counted half of the level bonus, so his total profession level was about 12. 3 profession levels could bring 1 ability point. When the total profession level was above 10 and entered grade 3, each advancement would also give an additional ability point. Soren directly gave up on upgrading other abilities including Danger Sense, Reflex Evasion Proficiency, Summon Shadow, and other powerful abilities. He put all his ability points into the Grasp of Shadows ability. Spend 1 ability point. Profession ability, Grasp of Shadows, upgraded to Shadow Manipulation. Spend 1 ability point. Profession ability, Shadow Manipulation, upgraded to Shadow Weaving. Prerequisite met. Sneak 150 achieved, Shadow Weaving achieved, Advanced Shadow Dancer achieved. You have mastered the advanced ability of the Shadow Dancer, Shadow Jump. Soren leveled up 3 times in a row. He gave up the combat skills of the Shadow Dancer, and also gave up the precious opportunity to directly master Danger Sense, and also gave up the additional spell-like ability of Summon Shadow. He almost gave up most of his core abilities in order to master Shadow Jump in advance. 1 slash. Soren used Shadow Jump to kill the Elven Ranger in front of him with 1 slash. Danger Sense, supernatural ability. Your perception will predict all attacks, whether it is a magic attack or a physical attack. Any attack against you will inevitably trigger a perception test. If you pass the perceptive sense test, you will be able to predict all attacks aimed at you in advance, including directional spells. You will gain additional perceptive sense ability to dodge all attacks. Note: this supernatural ability can be stacked with the supernatural talent of the super strong Sixth Sense. Shadow Jump, supernatural ability. You completely assimilate yourself into the shadows and transform into a shadow life form when activating Shadow Jump. In the state of Shadow Jump, any shadow within 100 meters can be used as a landing point for you to jump across planes. This supernatural ability is equivalent to a 100-meter blink teleportation spell. It can only be used when you are in stealth mode and in the shadows. This ability cannot be used to jump across planes to places without shadows. Note: this is the prerequisite ability of the legendary skill, Shadow Step. It can only be used once per day. Chapter 118. He died just like that. Everyone present was a little sluggish, especially the hunters who had just chased the Elven Ranger for half a day. As one of the Sons of Fear, even without counting the ability brought by the divine power of fear, the Elven Ranger was still a grade 4 profession. A ranger with a profession level of 15 or above was not so easy to kill. In their view, Soren was at most a grade 3 rogue, and his profession level was not necessarily level 10. But the moment when he broke out was beyond everyone's imagination, especially the ability to suddenly appear in the opponent's shadow. It was definitely possible for a high-grade rogue to do that. This was the power of advanced professions, to give up part of the ability to pursue the limit of a certain ability. Soren's comprehensive strength was certainly not comparable to a high-grade rogue, but after advancing into a shadow dancer, his lethality could directly kill a high-grade enemy that was 5 levels higher. Assassins used poison, lurkers used shadow escape, and shadow dancers relied on shadow jump that they had mastered in advance. Soren was most proficient in lurker. 1 second of shadow escape could allow him to avoid many fatal spells. He advanced into a lurker largely because he encountered many enemies with powerful spells. As long as it was a spell that could not attack across planes, lurkers could use shadow escape to avoid it. Among all advanced rogues, only shadow dancers had the lowest requirement to master, shadow jump. Even if lurkers wanted to use shadow jump, they would need more than 200 points of sneak, but lurkers could master the legendary ability, Shadow Realm, in advance. The level requirement for them to open the passage to the shadow plane was about 2 levels lower than other rogue professions. The time advanced to the 3rd second. Soren pulled out his curved sword and kicked the Elven Ranger's body down. Gloria had just recovered from her injuries, and her face was still very pale. The hunter's expressions changed from shock to anger because with the death of the Elven Ranger under Soren's sword, their ritual to the god of hunting had completely failed. The gnoll stared at him fiercely, and then his eyes fell on Vivian next to him. Since a son of fear had died, another could only replace it. Time continued to advance by 1 second. Vivian's small body was strangely suspended in the air. Her expression was very blank and her cute little face was pale. Suddenly, her brows furrowed tightly, and her expression became somewhat pained. The Elf Ranger was dead. Soren had absorbed all of his divinity, which gave him 3 divinity points in advance. However, Soren had no way of absorbing the divine power of fear that the Dread Lord had bestowed upon the Son of God. The power of the gods had great limitations. This was a power that was beyond the control of mortals. If one didn't have a divinity or a corresponding domain of divinity, then no one would be able to obtain this divine power. This was because it would reject one's body and in the end it could directly kill one. Soren was not the son of fear. He couldn't absorb the power that the Dread Lord left in his son's body, but this power wouldn't disappear into thin air. At the moment of the Elven Ranger's death, this power of fear began to shift, and its target was naturally Vivian, who had just awakened. The little girl showed a pained expression. She held her head with her small hands, and her whole body trembled slightly. As an 8-year-old girl with a profession level less than grade 2, she couldn't instantly integrate the power of 2 Sons of Fear. Moreover, judging from the Elven Ranger who just cast fear, he must have a lot of divine power of fear. He must be one of the more powerful Sons of Fear to be able to trigger the test of death effect and scare so many grade 2 and above enemies to death. If he was given a little more time, he could even grow into an existence that could compete for the throne of the Dread Lord in the future. A powerful divine power broke out. Vivian's body actually glowed, and the Elven Ranger's body quickly lost its vitality. It was an indescribable feeling. He had just died, but it seemed that he had been dead for a long time, even if his body hadn't begun to rot. The little girl's expression became more and more painful, and then she suddenly fainted with a scream, and her figure fell directly from the sky. Gloria opened her hands to catch her, but because she was very weak after being injured, she also fell to the ground. The physique of a witch was definitely not as good as that of a melee profession. Just now, even her protective spell had been activated. Perhaps her injury had reached the level of serious injury or even higher. Soren rushed over in an instant, holding his curved sword in front of the two. "Take her away." His expression was a little determined, and his face was unusually gloomy. He said in a slightly hoarse voice, "Use the teleportation spell. Go now and I'll cover you." The explosion of shadow jump couldn't be used casually. If one hadn't entered the legendary realm, using this ability would be like the barbarian's berserk talent. The body would consume a lot of energy when traveling through the shadow plane, and the whole person would also enter a state of fatigue directly after using it. Basically, all supernatural abilities were like this. After berserk, the barbarian would also be very weak. Soren was not a legendary rogue yet. His body still couldn't adapt to the backlash caused by the plane travel. After all, this was a supernatural spell-like ability, not a real teleportation spell of a wizard. In the case of a powerful explosion, he also had to pay a higher price, unless he mastered the legendary skill, Shadow Realm. Gloria's expression was very complicated. She looked at the many enemies in front of her. Although the followers of Mailer had suffered heavy casualties, there were at least a dozen hunters who were close to grade 4. These were all enemies with a profession level of 10 and above, and a few of them seemed to be dangerous characters with a profession level of 15. Soren couldn't be a match for these people at all. Not to mention that he had just used an explosive ability. Even if he was at his peak, it would be impossible for him to deal with so many enemies. "Go." Soren's expression was ferocious. He roared at her and roared, "Retreat to the back of the valley. You use the teleportation spell to take Vivian away. I have a way to stop them." The light of a spell appeared. The legendary elemental stone was activated by Soren. As the rocks and soil on the ground rolled, the ground in front of him directly connected to the elemental plane, and then he summoned and constructed a grade 4 earth elemental. The summoned earth elemental was not an advanced one. Soren directly controlled it through his will, and at the same time he made it block in front of the three of them. A grade 4 earth elemental. Its HP was close to 300 points. Soren would need to slash at it dozens of times to kill it, but it was enough to hold on for a while. Gloria's expression was complicated. There was a hint of struggle in her eyes, but in the end she gritted her teeth and began to cast spells quickly. Northern witches were not shy girls. Women who could grow up to become high-grade spellcasters were not simple. She naturally knew the price Soren had to pay for staying behind to block them, but if she wasted this precious time, the three of them would all die here. A high-grade wizard would always leave a way out for herself. She had already left a teleportation mark in a safe place before she set off. Soren didn't have time to talk nonsense. He clenched his curved sword and rushed forward, leaving Gloria with only a resolute back view. The earth elemental could stop the ordinary enemies, but it couldn't stop the high-grade professions. He had to fight for 30 seconds. A long-distance teleportation spell needed at least 30 seconds to cast. During this time she couldn't be attacked, or else she might be planning to cast the spell. The enemies in front of him reacted quickly. The first one to rush over was the black gnoll. It roared and its muscles swelled. Its veins twisted like earthworms. This was the monster's wild and violent ability. It didn't have any profession requirements. The battle couldn't be fought near Gloria, or else the enemy would directly throw a weapon at her and interrupt her casting. Soren controlled the earth elemental to block in front of him like a wall. He then jumped up and directly faced the gnoll hunter in front of him. Clang. A harsh collision sound was heard. Soren's figure fell back and a trace of blood flowed out of his mouth. 5 seconds had passed. The high-grade hunters sprinted for hundreds of meters and were already in front of them. Clang, clang, clang. Soren's arm was scratched by the sharp claws, and a piece of flesh was torn off. The protective energy of stone skin was still there, but it couldn't stop the enemy's attack. It was a hunter with a profession level of 15 or above. The earth elemental blocked in front of the enemies, waving its thick stone arms to force them away. However, there were still some who went around from the side. These high-grade professions could easily jump on roofs and run on walls. The heavy and slow earth elemental couldn't stop so many people. Swoosh! Soren directly threw his curved sword, and it hit the back of an enemy in an instant. The enemy staggered and fell to the ground. The moment he rolled to avoid the attack, 2 daggers appeared in his hands. Clang, clang, clang. 15 seconds later, a tall and majestic hybrid orc warrior rushed up. It only took one swing of its axe to make a dent in the earth elemental's arm. A 4th-grade creature couldn't win against a 4th-grade profession. The difference in combat skills between the two was too big. Soren opened up the distance between them, and then pointed his finger forward. 2 arcane missiles were shot out. The hybrid orc blocked the attack with its weapon, but it suddenly screamed. An energy beam hit its eye socket. The energy ring. Soren waited until now to use this precious item. 25 seconds had passed. A mixed blood orc rushed over from the side along the mountain wall and threw his weapon out. There was a muffled sound in the air. Gloria's energy protective force field was still there, but it was already showing signs of breaking. The energy barrier couldn't withstand the attacks of these tier 3 and above enemies, and they could break it within 3 moves if they tried to close the distance between them. 30 seconds had passed. Gloria completed the teleportation spell. The low-grade anywhere door could only teleport a short distance. If she wanted to leave safely, she had to teleport more than 100 miles away. Otherwise, she would be found by the enemy before she could recover her combat power. The hunter's tracking ability was stronger than the ranger's. She didn't even have time to memorize the spell again. A teleportation door opened. Gloria gritted her teeth and carried Vivian into the teleportation door. The enemies nearby were already 50 meters away. Before entering, she looked back at Soren and saw his back covered in blood. There were 5 claw marks on his back, but he was still standing like a rock. She didn't know why, but she suddenly felt very sad. A trace of moisture appeared in the corner of her eyes, and finally, it turned into a drop of something called a tear that she didn't know. As a high and mighty northern witch, this was the first time she had felt such a strong sense of powerlessness. If one was not a legendary being, it would be impossible to fight against so many enemies. Even a wizard couldn't do it. As Gloria stepped into the teleportation door with Vivian in her arms, the surrounding hunters suddenly roared in anger. The gnolls' eyes were bloodshot. They howled and rushed toward them like crazy. Soren's face was a little twisted. Because of fatigue and pain, his injuries were not light. Facing the enemies surrounding him from all directions, he smiled ferociously and murmured as if he was a little crazy, "I've been through so many storms and waves, and I've killed 3 times in the abyss. I don't believe I'll die in the hands of these trash who aren't even legendary. Goddess of luck, take care of me this time. I'll definitely repay you in the future. I'll definitely be on your side in the battle of the Titans." He suddenly took a deep breath. Then he used all his strength to jump out and forcibly broke out of the enemy's encirclement. He ran toward the other side of the cliff that was hundreds of meters high. After using his last burst of strength to open up the distance, he suddenly disappeared from the enemy's sight. Of the 2 shadow dancers, the last one was evade sight. Soren entered stealth. Chapter 119. The piercing cold wind was howling. On a wizard tower erected by the lakeside, a faint light suddenly appeared. The cold wind rolled up the snowflakes, but when they reached the surroundings of the wizard tower, they strangely disappeared. The snowflakes seemed to have hit an invisible barrier and fell lightly on the ground. On the 12th floor of the wizard tower, a portal made of a large number of gems and secret materials appeared with a light, and then Gloria appeared with Vivian in her arms. Wizards would set the location of long-distance teleportation to the safest place, and the most likely place was the wizard tower they controlled. The heavy steel golem stepped in and lowered its head to Gloria in front of it. "Dear Master, I'm sorry to disturb you. Is there anything you need?" Its voice was like the friction of metal. It used soul fragments as imprints, which gave it a certain degree of intelligence. This was a higher-level golem, and it could carry out some simple orders. Gloria glanced at it expressionlessly. A wizard who was prepared was unmatched. Even if she faced hundreds of hunters with her real strength, she was not powerless. However, too much of her power was in the wizard tower. In this wizard tower, there were 12 level 15 steel golems, and 36 level 10 clay golems and stone golems. Some of the powerful magic devices could not be shrunk to be carried around. In addition to the usual staff and scrolls, high-grade wizards would at most carry some protective equipment. Without the protection of the golem army, even high-grade adepts would not have the time to cast spells. Energy shields alone would not be enough to stop a large group of enemies. Gloria gently put Vivian on the bed. She raised her hand and stroked the little girl's pale face. She seemed to be a little uneasy. Vivian seemed to be unable to bear such a powerful divine power. The power of the Son of God was awakened step by step. Vivian had just become a wizard, and she had absorbed such a huge amount of divine power. The result was unpredictable. The Elven Ranger's divine power had obviously been transferred to her. The combined power of two children of God was at least at the legendary level. An 8-year-old girl might not be able to fuse them. No matter how powerful the bloodline was, it would still take time to fuse with it. The bloodline of the dragons was considered to be the best in the various planes, but young dragons were considered to be very fragile creatures. Vivian was like a baby dragon. When she was still in her infancy, her body had been injected with the power of an adult dragon or even an ancient dragon. If she couldn't control this power, she would either go mad or die. Gloria's fingertips glowed with a magical aura. After confirming that Vivian was only temporarily unconscious and not in any life-threatening danger, she walked towards the top of the wizard tower. She was going to perform a divination ritual. In the biting cold wind, Gloria walked to the top of the wizard tower, where there was an ancient astrology platform. This tower had been passed down for many years among the northern witches, and she was the new master. The northern witches had the talent for divination spells. Many of them were not wizards who specialized in divination spells, but they had an ancient inheritance in divination. Gloria took off the veil on her face, revealing a face that could topple countries. The wizard robe on her body was fluttering in the cold wind. The northern lands were always cold like knives. She knelt in front of the astrology platform and took out a set of delicate cards from her sleeve. There were mysterious runes on them. There was a price to pay for divination. Witches who often used divination spells or prophecy spells would have a shorter lifespan than other witches. This was because even witches rarely took the initiative to perform divination for others. She knew that the hope was slim. However, Gloria still wanted to know if Soren had survived. She hoped that he could survive. Whether it was divination or prophecy, the accuracy rate was not as high as one would expect. In order to obtain a sufficiently accurate divination, one had to pay a corresponding price. The most common price was one's lifespan. Gloria slowly closed her eyes. Her fingers shuffled the cards at an amazing speed, and the runes emitted a faint light. In the end, when she opened her palm, all the cards were suspended in the air on the astrology platform, emitting a sparkling magical aura. She still did not open her eyes. She just stretched out her hand and pulled out one card, then the second and finally the third. The other cards fell to the ground and she covered 3 cards in the center of the astrology platform. Gloria gently opened her eyes. Her expression seemed to be hesitating, but in the end she slowly opened the cards. She was a little worried that she had foreseen something bad. The first card was opened and it was a ferocious little devil. This was a demon from hell. Gloria's face was slightly pale because this could mean that Soren had died. His soul had been sent to hell and then turned into a demon. Of course, it could also mean something else. Because the northern witch's divination could only know the final answer after looking at all the cards. The second card was opened and it was a big tree that almost covered the sky. This was the legendary tree of life, and it was also the divine tree that the elves believed in and lived in. Gloria's face regained a trace of color, and her expression seemed to be a little surprised. She couldn't wait to flip open the third card, but this card made her silent because it was a big ghost card. This was the card that appeared the least in the northern witch's divination. The small ghost was engraved with the lowest class of demons, while the big ghost was engraved with a handsome face. He had dark skin and hair, and his pupils were flashing with the color of hell. He also had a pair of dark red horns on his head. This devil's clothes were rather extravagant. The colors were mainly red and black, and there were extremely complicated patterns on it. He held a ruby scepter in his hand and stood in front of the throne, looking down at everything with a high and mighty gaze, as if he was looking at the so-called living beings in the plane. This was the big devil. The legendary lord of the 9 hells, Asmodeus. The most powerful ancient demon in history had existed for countless years, and it was possible that he would continue to exist for countless more years. This was a card that represented many meanings, but it was definitely not a simple card when it appeared. Anyone who had a big devil in their divination would definitely not have an ordinary life. The little devil was one of the more common cards, but the big devil had only appeared a few times in the northern witch's divination. The last card was actually the big devil that represented the Lord of Hell. This was even more surprising to her than the big devil in the first card. For a moment, even Gloria couldn't determine whether Soren was alive or dead. For a high-grade northern witch to draw big and small devils at the same time in a divination ceremony, his fate was difficult to be determined by divination spells. This meant that even a legendary divination spell couldn't determine whether Soren was alive or dead. Gloria stood up with a complicated expression. Suddenly she staggered and almost fell on the astrology platform. A deep sense of powerlessness enveloped her body. In a trance, the scene around her completely disappeared. She seemed to see endless illusions and endless blood and fire burning. When she looked up, she saw the shadow of a goat's skull, and its pupils were burning with faint flames. The illusion only lasted for a short time. When she recovered from the backlash of the divination spell, she was already standing at the edge of the wizard tower. If she took one more step, she would fall from the wizard tower that was hundreds of meters high. The biting cold wind was still whistling. Her wizard robe was soaked, and there seemed to be a bone-chilling cold all over her body. A trace of blood flowed from the corner of her mouth. When she turned to look at the astrology platform, the card that represented the big devil had already burned and turned into ashes in the faint flames. The other two cards were still intact, but that one dissipated in the cold wind. The will of hell? Gloria suddenly trembled all over and murmured, "Could it be that the big ghost doesn't mean anything else? Does it really mean the Lord of Hell?" She seemed to have felt something. Gloria suddenly reached out and stroked her long hair. She didn't know when, but there were a few more silver strands in her hair. Chapter 120. Soren's figure disappeared into thin air in front of the hunter's eyes. It didn't even blink in the middle of the day, and Soren just disappeared like that. The natives of this world rarely encountered advanced professions because they were as rare as spellcasters. Out of 100 advanced professions, at least 90% of them were warriors, and only 1% of them were spellcasters or special advanced professions. Warriors were always the mainstream professions because any race or creature could advance into a warrior. Warriors were the only professions that could be chosen by any race. The Dark Knoll couldn't tell what ability Soren had used, but it was sure that he had entered stealth. It was no doubt that it was afraid of him. If Soren fought back with all his might, his life would be in danger. The Knoll wasn't sure if it could dodge the supernatural ability that came out of nowhere from the shadow behind it. So it hesitated for a moment, and only moved forward when the others nearby were close enough. It stopped at the place where Soren had disappeared for a moment, and sniffed the blood on the ground. Soren was heavily injured, and the Knoll could track him based on the smell of blood. Soren's tracks were faint, but there were drops of blood from time to time, which was the most obvious trace. 150 points of stealth. Soren had completely blended into the shadows, and no one could see him with the naked eye. He had chosen a backlit position, and the moment he rushed out, he entered stealth and disappeared from everyone's sight. Although stealth couldn't be seen with the naked eye, there were still traces left behind. Soren didn't dare to stop for even a moment, and quickly moved in the shadows. The Knoll couldn't see him with the naked eye, and if they only relied on smell and blood to track him, they wouldn't be able to find him so quickly. The regeneration effect of his 20 points of constitution had begun to take effect, and the wounds on Soren's body gradually stopped bleeding. The hunter's shouts came from behind, and under the Knoll's command the other hunters immediately spread out. Soren didn't dare to move in a way that was too obvious, because it would completely expose his position. He moved along the hard ground at a decent speed, which would make the footprints he left behind very inconspicuous. Sprinting away at high speed was impossible. His physical strength was not as good as these hunters because he was still injured. If he exposed his position, the enemy would soon catch up with him. At that time there would be no way out. Hunters with a profession level of 15 and above basically had one of their main attributes that was close to the realm of extraordinary. As high-grade professions below the legendary realm, they were completely different from the enemy Soren had faced before. While moving forward, Soren was also trying to figure out the best escape route. Hiding in the forest was definitely out of the question. High-tier jackalens were too good at tracking. As long as the smell of blood was still there, it was only a matter of time before it found him. If he wanted to escape, he would have to take some risks. He had made a crazy decision. In fact, when he activated Evade Sight, he had already made a crazy decision. In front of Soren was a cliff that was hundreds of meters high. This was a natural fault near the forest. There were lush trees below, and a small river could be vaguely seen in the distance. If he jumped from such a high place, he would definitely die. Even if he had 25 points of constitution, he wouldn't be able to withstand it. The damage from falling from such a high place was too great, and the probability of a legendary profession surviving was not very high. Of course, Soren wouldn't be so stupid as to jump down and pray that he would be fine. Perhaps even the goddess of luck couldn't do anything about it. He had never been a person who liked to gamble on his luck. Even if he wanted to gamble on his luck, he had to make sure that he had a certain degree of confidence. Soren quickly found his target. His expression was a little ferocious. Perhaps it was because it was too risky, and his calmness couldn't control his gradually accelerating heartbeat. Soren gritted his teeth and took a deep breath. Then he took out a hook from his multidimensional bag. It was the tool he used to climb over the wall of Whiterun. He took a deep look at the bottom of the cliff. About 100 meters above the ground, there was a small fault. There were protruding rocks nearby, and there was also a tree that wasn't very thick-rooted nearby. He silently calculated the position and tied the cloak on his back. It looked like the simplest parachute that could be opened after jumping down to reduce the speed of falling. He held the hook in his hand, the hook in his right hand, and the rope in his left hand that was about 20 to 30 meters long. After Soren took a deep breath, he suddenly jumped down from the cliff that was hundreds of meters high. The biting cold wind blew as he fell through the air. The scenery in front of Soren's eyes was falling at a crazy speed. He pushed his extraordinary agility and balance to the limit. The cloak slightly reduced his speed, but he was still falling rapidly. He tried his best to keep his eyes open and locked onto his target. After falling about 300 meters, Soren threw the hook in his hand. Life and death were decided in this instant. The next moment, the hook lock hit the tree trunk and wrapped around it 3 times. The hook was fixed between the branches of the tree trunk. The rope that Soren threw out straightened and tightened rapidly. Under the strong force of the fall, the rope was also pulled out of his palm quickly. His palm had become a bloody mess. The hook that was fixed to the tree was pulled taut. The moment the hook was hit by the force of the fall, Soren's hand that was holding onto the rope loosened a little. If he didn't reduce his strength at all, the rope might break directly. This process only took 2 seconds and lasted for 20 meters. Soren's hand that was holding onto the rope slowly moved down, allowing the rope to break free from his hand. At the same time, he used a perfect amount of force to counteract the force of the fall. The friction caused by the rapid fall made his palm bleed. His skin and flesh were stuck to the rope, and his bones could be vaguely seen. 20 meters was enough to counteract most of the force of the fall. When the rope in his hand was rapidly reduced to less than 2 or 3 meters in length, Soren suddenly wrapped his arm around the rope, and then the remaining strength burst out at this moment. The rope instantly sank and the tree branch above it shook a little. The recoil caused Soren's falling speed to suddenly stop, and he even flew up a little. The tree branch was able to withstand the force of the fall. The rope was also able to reduce the force of the fall due to the friction, and it didn't break immediately. Soren's body rebounded for 3 to 5 meters due to the deformation of the tree branch, and he fell down a little more. However, the force of the fall was already very weak. He successfully counteracted the force of the fall and stabilized himself in midair. He was about 100 meters away from the ground, and if he jumped from this height he would still die. Soren panted a little to recover his strength. He allowed his injured arm to recover from the force of the fall, and drank a healing potion at the same time. Then he began to shake the rope lightly, and the swaying gradually became stronger. Finally he hit a rock on the cliff. Clang! A dagger with a cold gleam pierced into the rock. Soren's swaying body immediately stabilized in front of the cliff. He looked at the steep cliff and stepped on a protruding rock. Then he clenched his teeth and used his other bloody hand to pull out a second dagger, and stabbed it into a spot next to him. Phew! Soren let out a long breath and then slowly took a deep breath. He untied the rope on his body and stepped on a protruding rock that was less than 3 centimeters wide. Then he used the force of the dagger to slowly climb down the cliff. Clang! Clang! Sparks flew everywhere. The dagger in Soren's hand was very close to breaking. However, he had already climbed tens of meters, and the protruding rocks were increasing. His speed was also increasing. There were some places where he could directly climb down, but when there was no place to borrow force, he would use the dagger to open a path. He relied on his explosive strength and the support of his 20 points of physique. He used the sword form, heavy hack, to stab the dagger into the cliff to absorb the force of the fall. He was getting closer and closer to the ground. When he was about 30 meters away from the cliff, Soren directly slid down the cliff. The friction from the fall made his injuries worse, but when he was about 10 meters away he directly jumped down from a height of about 3 stories. Bang! Soren knelt down on one knee to reduce the force of the fall. His bones felt like they were about to fall apart, and his injuries were all over his body. He only had a quarter of his HP left. The accumulated bruises were actually close to 30 points. If it wasn't for his physique, he would have already lost all his strength. On the cliff, the figures of the hunters appeared at the edge of the cliff. The moment Soren jumped down the cliff, they had already discovered his tracks, and in the next moment, they would forever remember this crazy enemy. After Soren landed, he raised his head and looked at them. His face was a little ferocious. Suddenly he laughed crazily, and in the end it turned into a crazy laugh. His body was covered with wounds. His palms were already showing some white bones, and his back was a mess of flesh and blood. His injuries made him look like a demon, but he was definitely crazier than them. I knew I wouldn't die here. Soren looked at the cliff that was hundreds of meters high with a murderous gaze, and then ran away without looking back. One day, he would take back what he had lost today. Chapter 121. Beside a clear river. Traces of blood spread along the river. Soren's expression was grim as he cleaned the wounds on his body. Then he gritted his teeth and used a needle and thread to sew up the cut flesh. Once he put some distance between them, it would be impossible for them to catch up with him. The stealth ability of a rogue was no joke. If they wanted to track a rogue like him in the wilderness, they would need a legendary level tracking profession. By the time they found a way to get down the cliff, Soren had already put more than 10 kilometers of distance between them and disappeared from their tracking range. After making sure that it was safe, Soren stopped to treat his wounds. The smell of blood on his body was too strong. Even if he got rid of the hunters, he might attract other beasts. The wilderness was full of creatures that were very sensitive to the smell of blood. Tisk. Soren bit off the needle and thread with his teeth and then looked at the wound on his arm. His face was very ugly. It was the first time in a long time that he was forced into such a miserable situation. He almost died there. The wounds on other parts of his body were better, but the wound on his back was more difficult. He couldn't sew the wound there. He could only apply some ointment and let the regeneration effect of his 20 points of constitution recover. Although the river was unusually cold in late autumn, he still went in to wash himself because there was too much blood on his body. Soren's face was a little pale when he got out of the river. Perhaps it was because he had lost a lot of blood. He took out some jerky and chewed it while using a level 0 spell to dry himself. The elemental stone in his arms had become a little dim because its power had been exhausted. It had to wait for 7 days to fully recover. This legendary level equipment could be said to have saved his life. It summoned the earth elemental to restrain a lot of enemies, and the stone skin spell had blocked at least 6 attacks for him. The curved sword had been thrown out to attack the enemies, and Soren only had 2 daggers in his hands that were close to being scrapped. He didn't recklessly look for the hunters for revenge. Instead, he moved further away. First, he had to rest for a night to recover. On the one hand, he had to heal his wounds, and on the other hand, he had to restore his energy. Spell-like abilities were bloodline abilities. As long as he had a good night's sleep, he could use Shadow Jump and Evade Sight again tomorrow. Equipment was very important. Soren needed to find a weapon and recharge the equipment he had used. For example, if he had enough alchemy skills, he could recharge the ring by himself. As for the safety of Gloria and Vivian, Soren wasn't too worried. With the wisdom of the high-grade northern witches, they definitely wouldn't use short-distance teleportation. Low-level blink spells were useless. They could only temporarily avoid attacks. The teleportation portal was too short. Even if they escaped, they would be tracked by the enemy. Gloria had opened a long-distance teleportation portal. If he wasn't mistaken, it should be her wizard tower. Vivian was safe there for the time being, and Soren could look for her after he recovered from his injuries. The North and the Frost Kingdom were separated by hundreds of miles of glacial mountains. It was difficult for ordinary people to cross, but it was much easier for him to cross alone, because he could also learn spells. Fly was a level 3 spell. Soren could now learn it. Although the duration was only 1 point for 1 minute, it was enough for him to fly a long distance. In this world, the pursuit of fly was not very high. Generally, teleportation was used for long distances. Except for some advanced alchemy devices during the Arcane Empire, the fastest creature to fly should be the dragon. Only when there was a need would there be a pursuit. The birth of teleportation made too many spellcasters focus on the study of the space dimension. Some supernatural environments were dangerous to fly in. After a short rest, Soren began to walk along the river. It was easy to gather near a water source. He'd better find an elven village first. The injury on his back couldn't be delayed. If possible, he needed to find a priest to treat it. Otherwise it would take at least 3 or 4 days to recover. Maybe it was because he had been injured too often. Soren's heal skill had risen quickly. It had reached 27 points in heal. If it rose further, he would be at the level of a professional doctor in town who was responsible for treating sword wounds. Along the way he didn't stop at all. When he saw the road ahead, he knew he was close to the gathering place of the elves. Sure enough, soon there was a field of farmland. Farming required fertile land and sufficient water. Most intelligent creatures would choose to cultivate the better land. Before arriving at the village, Soren met an elven patrol. All of them were archers, wearing exquisite leather armor, and were equipped with long swords, short swords and other weapons. The elves rarely used heavy weapons. The captain stopped Soren and asked him. He carefully looked at Soren, then warned him not to cause trouble and let him go. It was easy for humans to move around. If there were orcs or gnolls, they would probably just catch them. After entering the village, Soren immediately went to the elven temple. It was a temple of the goddess of life. The current goddess of life was the second wife of the elven guardian. She was in charge of the priesthood of spring, fertility, birth, planting and so on. The oldest goddess of life had disappeared for a long time. No one knew if she had fallen or not. The priesthood of life was now divided among many gods. Currently, most of the priesthoods with the symbol of the goddess of life were in a certain field. For example, the goddess of life of the elves, the goddess of life of the halflings and so on. Unless someone took away most of the priesthood of life, then they could become the real goddess of life. There was nothing much to say about this goddess of life. It was worth mentioning that the former elven goddess of life was the legendary Queen of Spiders, the first wife of the elven patron god, and now the Lord God served by the drows in the Underdark. She was also the most powerful, evil and cunning abyss demon god. No one expected that the first Queen of Spiders would fall so low and become one of the most powerful demons of the Chaos Evil faction. Perhaps it was because of her existence that others had a deeper understanding of the depravity of the gods. In fact, Soren admired the Queen of Spiders because she was really powerful. During the time of troubles, many gods had fallen or lost a lot of power. Only the Queen of Spiders had become the demon closest to the Dominator level in the abyss. In just 5 years she had risen from a mid-level divine power to a great divine power. She was even close to becoming a greater divine power. If she had not had so many enemies, she might have been able to become a greater divine power god. In other words, she could create a world out of thin air. The standard to measure a greater divine power was vague. The easiest way to understand was to say, God said let there be light, so there was light. This was the standard of a greater divine power. So far there had not been any greater divine power gods. Some of the ancient gods with greater divine power had already fallen. At most, the current gods had opened up a divine kingdom in a certain plane. The standard of the temple was one level lower than the temple. There were very few priests with a profession level of 10 and above. The one in charge of receiving Soren was a middle-aged male elf. He looked more elegant and was probably a priest around level 8. The main way priests made money was to treat injuries and then sell various healing potions. The temple needed money to maintain, expand faith and improve power. The priests of the goddess of wealth even became professional merchants. Most temples sold healing magic to the outside world, and it was the kind that clearly marked the price and refused to be haggled. Soren bought a healing medium injury potion at a shocking price of 200 Kindler coins. The cost and expense of healing magic were destined to be difficult to popularize. Ordinary people mainly relied on medicine and doctors for treatment. The effect of the magic was amazing. Soren recovered quickly after the priest cast the magic. The wound on his back gradually healed, and only a shallow red mark could be seen. After buying 2 bottles of healing potions, he walked out of the elven temple. Then he saw a team of well-equipped elven guards escorting a handsome elven noble on a white horse. The elves were naturally not equal. Ordinary elves were similar to ordinary human civilians. It was a male elf with long green hair. Needless to say, his bloodline was undoubtedly quite noble because the nearby elves slightly bowed their heads when they saw him. Soren also noticed the elven noble. After seeing some characteristics, the corner of his mouth could not help but show a strange smile. It seemed that the elven noble in front of him was the descendant of the goddess of life. Of course, he was not the first generation of the Son of God. It should be a divine bloodline that had been passed down for many years. His talent was only much stronger than ordinary people, but not at the level of the Son of Fear. The elven guards escorted him to the Temple of Life. Soren quickly stepped aside to let them pass. The elven guard looked at him with surprise because there were not many human adventurers in the forest, and there were even fewer rogues who were alone. Speaking of which, the elven lord was really difficult to evaluate. As the patron of the elves, his first wife fell into the abyss and became the goddess of spiders. Basically, he could do whatever he wanted. Many people knew the character of the Queen of Spiders. Just look at how licentious the drows were. There were also some secret rumors about his second wife. It was said that she once had a child with a mortal, and it was some time after she became the goddess of life. Of course, the official statement was that the mortal was originally the incarnation of the elven lord. In fact, it was just a couple playing around. But no one knew the real situation. However, according to legend, the elven lord was a hermaphrodite. In the past, his incarnation would sometimes be female, and he would have some stories with some outstanding mortal males. So maybe he really did not care much about these things. The elven noble in front of him should be the descendant of the goddess of life. Although it was not clear who the Queen of Elves had a child with, Soren felt that it was definitely not the child of the elven lord. Because the bloodline of two gods could not still be in the mortal world. The probability of that kind of child being born as a god was too low. Chapter 122. It was not easy to evaluate the descendants of the divine blood. Because strictly speaking, Gloria was also a descendant of the divine blood, because the predecessor of the Northern Witches was split from a powerful organization. This organization had existed for a long time, and their leader was even a chosen of the goddess of magic. During that time, many powerful witches were born in the north, some of which were even comparable to the gods. That era was too long ago. Only the oldest ruins and documents had records of the chosen one of the north. Gloria, as the purest northern witch, would more or less have a trace of the bloodline inheritance. This bloodline was similar to the elven noble in front of him. Some could strengthen their own talents, and some had basically exhausted their power. It was like the god of slaughter had fallen for a long time, but many of his descendants, the former sons of slaughter, had survived the catastrophe of slaughter. These descendants reproduced generation after generation, and in the end they were basically no different from ordinary people. Occasionally, there would be some people with more amazing talents, but their bloodline was thin to the point of 1 in 10 million. In fact, there were many such people. Therefore, most of the bloodline of the sons of God referred to within 3 generations. Beyond this range, they were not considered descendants of the divine blood. The elven noble in front of him did not even have a trace of divinity in his body, let alone divine power. At best, his bloodline talent was better than ordinary people, and his basic attributes were higher than ordinary people. This bloodline talent was roughly equivalent to the direct descendants of legendary professions, and it might even be inferior to the descendants of legendary professions. What? There was a saying that the hero template had inherited the blood of massacre, so it could extract soul energy. Among the natives of this world, only a small number of very special existences could increase their strength through killing. These special existences were basically related to the domain of the massacre priesthood. However, this saying had never been verified. Soren did not pay much attention to the elven noble. He went straight to the inn ready to rest for a day. This village was not small and the population was large. According to this progress, it was only a matter of time before it developed into a town. Soren's half-elven bloodline was thin, and he looked like a human from the outside, so he did not receive any preferential treatment. These elves just regarded him as an adventurer, and their attitude was basically cold. Elves were not a race that was easy to get along with. It was the outside world that was curious about them, and then the bards beautified them. Soren even thought that the stubborn dwarves were easier to deal with than the elves. There was a weapon shop in the village. The blacksmith was a burly elf, and he didn't look elegant. He also held a hammer and hammered loudly, and he was wearing an apron. In this world there was no such thing as a naturally elegant race. To eat, drink and defecate one had to farm. To live one had to work. Similarly, the elves would use their excrement to fertilize the land. Some of the droll who believed in the way of the earth would even personally do some of the seemingly dirty labor, viewing it as a form of cultivation. Yes. The last one was influenced by the warrior monks, especially the ascetic monks among the warrior monks. Over the long years, a large number of paths of professionals had been produced. Things that remained unchanged would only gradually be eliminated. The Droll Order was now considered a relatively powerful spellcasters' organization. The enlightened faction among them had even accepted the elemental thought of shamanism. The elven village Soren was in was within the scope of the way of the earth. In the middle of the village there was an ancient stone pillar. From this point of view, this world was still full of endless vitality. The burly elf blacksmith glanced at Soren. It was best not to underestimate the blacksmiths. They were firmly in the middle class, and it was also an area where professionals often advanced. Those who dared to cause trouble in a weapon shop would always regret it in the end. Of course, Soren wouldn't underestimate the blacksmith in front of him. He had been forging for more than 10 years and he was basically a warrior. He nodded slightly and said, "I want to buy a high-quality curved sword. The price is not a problem." "A curved sword?" The burly elf blacksmith glanced at him, pulled out a curved sword from behind and handed it to him. He said, "What do you think of this one?" "Whiteboard." Soren didn't even need to look at it. He touched it and knew that it was a whiteboard equipment and it was a little light. He shook his head in disappointment and said, "It's too light. I'm afraid that it won't be able to withstand the explosive power of battle. It might even damage the weapons used against gnolls." The elf blacksmith glanced at him again and said, "Then I don't have any better ones. I mainly make sickles and kitchen knives here. If not, I make longswords used by the patrol guards. If you want longswords, I have a few good ones here." Longswords used by the patrol guards? Soren thought for a while and realized that they were using fine craftsmanship. The blacksmith in front of him could make fine craftsmanship weapons? Basically, those who could make fine craftsmanship weapons could use some special materials to make rare grade 1 weapons. The craftsmanship of the elves was not bad. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to make 2 legendary curved swords in the Underdark. The blacksmith in front of him was obviously not a master, but he should be able to make a +1 curved sword, right? High-level blacksmiths were rare. It wasn't that their craftsmanship wasn't good enough, but the blacksmith masters were all high-level professionals. Among them there were also wizards who studied alchemy. The one who had forged the legendary curved sword for Sauron was a level 15 ranger, level 3 Michaeli Wanderer and level 8 warlock. Not only that, he was also a quarter of the dragonborn bloodline. His family had once captured a shadow dragon. The shadow dragon wasn't the key. The key was that this shadow dragon was male, so the evil drows imprisoned it. They also used some kind of special transformation technique to turn it into a human. What happened next was needless to say. The drows couldn't do anything good. A group of female drows imprisoned it for a long time. Every day they did some activities that were not suitable for children. In the end, they successfully gave birth to a large number of mixed-blood half-draconians. After the male shadow dragon escaped, he was about to go crazy. He risked his life to massacre the group of drows, but there were still some half-dragons who survived. The blacksmith who made the legendary curved sword for Soren was one of them. In order to make the curved sword, Soren was busy with a lot of things for him. He even killed one of the candidates for the matriarch of a family. The blacksmith in front of him naturally didn't have such high requirements. Soren looked at him and asked tentatively, "If I give you the materials, can you make a rare weapon?" The elven blacksmith looked at him, thought for a moment and said in a deep voice, "It's definitely possible with the materials, but I don't know alchemy. There's no way to add elemental damage." That was enough. Soren didn't dare to ask for elemental damage. That kind of thing needed 100 or 200 points of alchemy to add. For him, he was satisfied to be able to make an ordinary +1 rare curved sword. There were a lot of third-rate blacksmiths. There were very few who could make military products, and even fewer who could use alchemy to enchant weapons. The dwarves boasted about their blacksmiths. When Soren went to the dwarves, he only saw a group of high-grade blacksmiths with 150 to 250 points of forging skill. Damn it, there was no one in the whole Forge Castle who could make a grade 3 legendary curved sword. Sure enough, the dwarves' words couldn't be trusted too much. These guys only knew how to brag when they drank, and their bragging wasn't reliable at all. The elven blacksmith in front of him looked like he was approaching middle age. At this age he must have been blacksmithing for a long time. His forging skill should be above 200 points, and he should be able to make a grade 1 rare curved sword. Soren immediately said, "Tell me what materials you need. I'll get them for you as soon as possible." Grade 1 rare materials weren't that rare. He probably had some fine iron here, but he probably lacked some other things. 300 kindler. The elven blacksmith wasn't in a hurry. He first looked at Soren, then took out a rough piece of paper and wrote a row of things. "You just need to find a few things on this list. You can buy them from Priest Hierro." Soren reached out and took a look. The things on the list weren't that rare. They were worth around 200 kindler. Among them, fluorite was the easiest to find. A custom-made weapon was twice as expensive as a second-hand weapon. 500 Kindler was still within Soren's acceptable range. So he didn't hesitate to agree. For a moment he actually felt a little emotional. After coming to this world for so long, he could finally get his hands on a rare weapon. Although it was only a grade 1 weapon, he was already satisfied. At the very least, the customized curved sword could be made according to his standards, and it would definitely be more convenient than the military products he bought before. For a skillful rogue like him, the weapon must be the most suitable for him to use. Otherwise, it wouldn't be difficult to buy a +1 longsword, and it would be enough to spend a little more money. But the problem was that a 1.2-meter longsword was a longsword, and a 1.3-meter longsword was also a longsword. These guys were all called longswords, but the feeling of holding them in his hand was completely different. Rogues weren't as picky as warriors when it came to weapons. The skills of warriors determined that the requirements for weapons were greatly reduced. The deal was finalized. After the elven blacksmith got the deposit, he began to work. He needed to temper the fine iron first. Rare weapons were all made with the technique of 100-fold steel forging. The specialty of the elves' forging was that they could create small fish scale patterns when hammering. The dwarves' forging technique was high hardness, while the elves' forging technique was good toughness. The weapons they made weren't easy to break. Soren directly went to buy all the materials, basically without bargaining, and then sent them here. The elven blacksmith seemed to be very interested in forging rare weapons. He even started the furnace overnight, saying that the forging could be completed within 3 days. This was undoubtedly very good news. At that time, Soren's injuries were almost completely healed. P.S. Later I will post the new curved sword model in the related works. After it passes the review, you should be able to see it. You guys are awesome. Futo will release more chapters tomorrow. Chapter 123. After the materials were ready, the elven blacksmith started working overnight. A sickle was worth 20 copper kindler, and a kitchen knife was worth 30 copper kindler. The long swords of the elven guards were considered military products, and they were only worth about a dozen kindler. The elven blacksmith could only earn 4 or 5 kindler for a high-quality military weapon, but he could earn about 100 kindler by forging a curved sword for Soren. The higher the grade of the weapon, the higher the value, and the higher the requirement for forging skills and materials. The forging was not very difficult. The elven blacksmith had prepared elven steel ingots, fish scale steel, in advance. The key was the special material that cost 200 kindler, which was not something that ordinary people could afford. Only 1 or 2 people in the whole village were equipped with rare-grade weapons, and it would take an ordinary elven patrol guard 10 years to earn enough money. The forging of this weapon was equivalent to 2 or 3 years of income. The elven blacksmith called all his apprentices over, then began to hammer and prepare, taking out pieces of refined steel ingots that were about 10 centimeters long. Soren had nothing to do. He watched for a while, then went back to the hotel to rest. He was very tired today and needed to recover his spirit. He had already drawn the model of the curved sword for the elven blacksmith. It was a heavy-duty curved sword, and its slashing and piercing abilities were first-class, similar to the style of the drows. On the second floor of the hotel, the elven proprietress thoughtfully prepared dinner for him and brought him a basin of hot water for him to soak his feet. Of course, she would not serve Soren so well for no reason. The main reason was the kindler that he threw out. After becoming an adventurer, Soren did not care much about the kindler, but for ordinary people, it was a few days' income. The elven proprietress, who was somewhat beautiful but not very beautiful, made a bed for Soren and brought him a new blanket. After making sure that Soren did not have any other requests, she left with a smile on her face. If she served such a generous guest well, he might not even need to give her change at the checkout. That was still several silver dirhams. Adventurers worked with their lives on the line, so they were more generous with their expenses. Before leaving, the lady boss even asked Soren if he needed any other services, but she was immediately rejected by Soren. Elves were not all elegant and noble. If the upper beam was not straight, the lower beam would be crooked as well. The elven gods were famous for doing as they pleased. The overly long lifespan of the elven race also determined that many elven couples would gradually lose their sense of novelty. At the very least, humans were still bound by traditional moral rules. Some places were even marked with red moles that represented chastity. The elves, on the other hand, were much less restrained. Some of their hardcore challenges even left Soren speechless. This was especially true for Droll from the chaotic neutral and neutral evil faction. While there was a group of respectable and devout Droll, there was another group of extremely depraved people who wouldn't even spare wild beasts. If you met that kind of person, you would definitely want to kill him to leave some clean air in the world. The elves were also more particular about their special services. They were not like humans who used coercion and bribery. Sometimes it even felt like a tryst. The waitresses in the tavern were really waitresses, but the ones who provided the service were a different group of people. The elves were famous for being picky, and it was the same here. They would choose their guests carefully. If the guest was charming, handsome, and generous, the lady boss of the tavern would not mind having a tender moment with him. The elves valued their beliefs. As long as their beliefs were firm, their hearts would be pure. In their long lives they valued pleasure very much. In Silvery Moon City, which had been rebuilt many times in the north, there was a masquerade ball hosted by a priest of the goddess of love. At the ball, one could meet many noble ladies and even a priest of the elven gods. In fact, many people knew what the ball would become in the end. Soren had attended a few times in the past. In order to investigate a serious matter, he even met the incarnation of the goddess of love. However, that was after the end of the time of troubles. For some reason, the goddess of love almost deviated to the chaotic evil faction. In the end, even if Soren and other top legendary professions interfered, she still deviated from the chaotic good faction to the chaotic neutral faction. Because of this, the priests who originally worshipped the chaotic good faction of love, all changed to the chaotic neutral faction of love, which worshipped self-enjoyment and the pursuit of excitement to satisfy the emptiness of the soul. There was a legend that she fell into the hands of the Queen of Succubus during the time of troubles, and went through a miserable imprisonment. The Queen of Succubus. What good could come of falling into her hands? Soren lay comfortably on the bed and placed his weapon where he could easily reach it. Then he closed his eyes. Although he was very tired, he could not fall asleep for a while. He was worried about Vivian's condition. He was very clear about the power of the children of God. When they fully unleashed their power, they were at the legendary level. Moreover, this divine power was not included in the original profession level. The divine power in Vivian's body had just awakened, and then she absorbed the divine power of another child of God. He did not know if she could fuse with it. After all, she was still too young. Her body had not even started to develop yet, and she was already like a baby dragon, unable to bear the power of an adult dragon. If you let a child exert the strength of an adult to carry 100 or 200 pounds, there would only be one result, and that was muscle strain and even bone damage. Now, Soren could only hope that Gloria had a way to suppress Vivian's power, so that her body could get some time to adapt. He still could not sleep. Soren opened his data page and checked his main attributes. Name: Soren. Race: half-elf. Attributes: Strength 14 plus 2, Dexterity 21 plus 1, Constitution 20, Intelligence 20 plus 1, Wisdom 15, Charm 16. Alignment: Lawful Evil Class, Level 10 Commoner / Level 7 Rogue 015500 / Level 2 Shadow Dancer 021500 / Level 5 Wizard 03650. Grade 2 Health Points 85136. Experience Points 2075, Slaughter EXP 300. Class EXP. Unassigned Skill Points, none. Attribute Points, none. Legend Level 4. Divinity 3. Status: Normal. Basic Skills: Sneak 151, Literacy 115, Steel 35, Picklock 45, Snare 55, Focus 15, Negotiate 12, Appraise 10, Deception 5, Intimidation 12, Taunt 8, Act 3, Listen 12, Evasion 75, Parry 15, Block 12, Heal 27, Search 15, Detect 15, Copy Scroll 15, Spellcraft 12, Survival 11, Use Magic Device 12, Cooking 21. Legendary Skills: Omnipotent Hands, Sealed, Weakened. Personal Abilities: Nimble Left Hand, Eidetic Memory, Perseverance, Encyclopedic Knowledge, Reflex Evasion, Nimble Movement, Evade Sight, Dark Vision, Regeneration. Beginner. Profession Abilities: Shadow Weave, Military Weapon, Proficiency, Curved Sword. Master. Combat Skills: Shadow Strike, Shadow Leap, Counterspell, Sword Form, Heavy Hack. How did I get 3 more legend points? Soren opened the battle record data with some surprise because his legend points increased by 3. Then he found the following line of data records: Hunting Ritual, Legendary Battle. At the end of September 1675 in the Elven Kingdom, the believers of Malor, the god of hunting, held a ritual to hunt the Son of Fear in order to regain the attention of their god. This legendary hunting ritual was interrupted by you. Their prey, the Son of Fear, profession level 16, was killed by you. Your existence will be known by more and more evil creatures. Legend level +3, So it really was a legendary hunting ritual. Soren looked at his other attributes. The number of abilities he had mastered had increased a lot. There was no such thing as too many abilities. The more abilities he had, the more powerful he would be. The increase in basic skills was not very obvious. Except for the skill points allocated by the profession level, the average increase in all skills was about 10 points. Soren had fought a lot until now, and he didn't know when he could reach the average of 100 points. In the legendary realm, it was best to increase all basic skills to more than 100 points. Otherwise it wouldn't be a legendary realm but a disability. When one's strength reached the legendary realm, they would basically be able to comprehend other things by analogy. There couldn't be any obvious shortcomings in basic skills. Omnipotent Hands was still in a sealed state. For some reason, Soren clearly felt that its passive effect was still there, but he couldn't use it actively. There must be a problem somewhere. If it was a temporary weakness, he should have recovered long ago. Soren judged that the biggest possibility was that he might have been permanently cursed or damaged by magic. Otherwise, his soul might have been damaged. Many attacks on the soul couldn't be healed naturally, and had to rely on some powerful divine spells to remove and recover. It should be impossible for him to have been hit by any magic. Spells like Stun, Energy Drain, and Shapeshift were too overbearing. There was no way he wouldn't be affected at all. Soren felt that if it wasn't a special curse, it should be a weakened state due to damage to his soul. If it's damage to my soul, then it's troublesome. He looked at his own data, then his eyes fell on the 3 divinity that he got from killing the Elven Ranger. He murmured, "Damage to my soul needs at least restoration to recover, and maybe even greater restoration. Where can I find a priest with a profession level of 15 and above? Priests of this level are all bishops. It's not easy to see them, let alone pay them to cast restoration." Cash was definitely not enough. If he could sell the gems, he should be able to get enough money to cast restoration, which should be about 300 to 50 Kindler coins. Greater restoration was out of the question. It was a level 9 divine spell. As long as one was still breathing, they could be revived to full health. Basically, it was very difficult to buy. Above that, resurrection could also repair damage to the soul, but one had to negotiate with the Grim Reaper to cast it. Otherwise, the soul couldn't return to the body, and the resurrected person would be in a vegetative state. Probably no legendary priest would be bored enough to pay such a high price to cast resurrection on a living person. The purpose was just to heal, right? In the end, Soren's eyes fell on the 3 divinity. These divine powers were like a barrel of refined gasoline. Once it was used up, it was basically gone. The existence of the divine persona continued to supply them with divine power, so their divine power was endless. If he cut off the supply of divine power, the divine power of all the Sons of Fear would drop rapidly. Elven Rangers had divine power and divinity, but they had no divine personality or divine title. When Soren killed him, his divine power was transferred to Vivian. Logically speaking, his divinity should have been transferred to Vivian as well. However, divinity was a type of soul-like energy. When gods killed each other, they would also deprive each other of their divinity. That was why Soren had absorbed the divinity into his body. Although divinity could bring great power, it also contained the will of the Dread Lord. It could be simply understood as a kind of soul fragment that turned into divinity energy. Divine power gathered in a Son of Fear. Divinity also gathered in a Son of Fear. The soul fragment of the Dread Lord merged in the Son of Fear's body and became a new soul imprint of the Dread Lord. His will would also be transferred to the Son of Fear, who had merged with a large amount of divinity. Finally, he would directly destroy the other party's soul and take back all his divine power to resurrect. This was a battle of wills. It was also the most difficult battle of wills in history. After many gods defeated their opponents, their own wills were affected by other people's divinity. In the process of merging divinity, there was an extremely difficult test of will. If your will was higher than your opponent's, the power of divinity would completely transform into your own power. If your will was lower than your opponent's, then the opponent's residual will would affect your consciousness and may even occupy your consciousness to resurrect. There were many eccentric gods. These guys' extreme personalities were the key to being influenced by divinity. The residual divinity retained the core of the original god's will. For example, the power of the divinity of lust. The gods who had mastered the divinity of lust in the past were all temperamental and keen on all kinds of enjoyment. They liked to do things that were incomprehensible. These gods fell one after another, but the personalities of their avatars were all the same. The reason was that they were affected by the residual divinity. The most extreme divinity was stacked layer by layer. The more gods they had, the more extreme emotions and preferences they would have. That was why there were so many crazy gods. Merging divinity was a battle of wills. If Soren could suppress the will of the Dread Lord, then he would be able to transform the power of the divinity. If he failed, his consciousness would be closer to the devil and he might even be controlled by him. It was dangerous. It was also very tempting. The path for mortals to become gods was destined to be full of thorns. If they wanted to walk on this path, they would not be able to reach the end without great determination and perseverance. Many legendary wizards did not dare to become gods because they could not suppress the will of the divinity. They were afraid that their personality would change drastically, and they were afraid that they would magnify certain emotions to the extreme. They were even more afraid that they would gradually lose themselves. This was very fatal for wizards. They already had a long lifespan and great power. Why would they gamble everything to become gods? Stepping into the realm of the gods was equivalent to entering the battlefield of the gods. 10 years ago, 10 years later, your personality was constantly changing, and your behavior was also gradually changing. It was because of change that everything was endless. From naive and childish to mature and steady, from frivolous behavior to sophisticated handling of affairs. The biggest danger of divinity was not the change, but whether you could hold on to yourself, in the battle of wills and not let your true soul lose its direction. If you lost your way in the battle of power, even gods would become crazy. There were many gods like this, especially those who became gods because of luck. In the end, all of them had strange personalities. That was why many legendary wizards were afraid. In history, the number of people who became gods as wizards could be counted on one hand. Soren's current state was not suitable for absorbing divinity. Although he was confident in his own will, he was not arrogant enough to think that he could completely suppress the Dread Lord. However, if he succeeded in suppressing these 3 points of divinity, then the Dread Lord's will would completely disappear. In other words, a part of the soul imprint that he transferred to the deity's body would completely disappear. No matter which deity he planned to resurrect in the future, the final battle of wills would weaken a lot because a part of his soul was completely swallowed by Soren. The divine power was in Vivian's body, and the divinity was in Soren's body. Although Vivian's power was weakened, part of the test of will was transferred to Soren. According to the normal process, the stronger the divine power of the deity of fear, the more divinity there would be in the body, and the easier it would be to be affected. But now the result was that the divine power in Vivian's body had doubled, but the divinity was still the same. Soren felt that he seemed to have found a way to fight against the Dread Lord. If all the divine power was transferred to Vivian's body, and all the divinity was suppressed by him, then the plan to resurrect the Dread Lord would fail by half. Vivian had strong divine power, but she was not affected by the divinity. The final result was a balance. If the Dread Lord was more important, then the divinity of fear would be transferred to him. If Vivian was more important, then the divinity of fear would be transferred to her, because the Dread Lord's own divinity had disappeared and scattered. It was as if Soren had cleared up his thoughts and cleared up his mind. His expression was cold and the killing intent in his eyes was very strong. Because he found a way to fight against the Dread Lord as a mortal. That was, he would kill the other surviving deities of fear. Killing. This was what Soren was best at. Killing for Vivian was the most normal thing to do. Just like when the little girl would raise her little head and say without hesitation, "If you kill people, I'll set the fire for you." Soren also did not hesitate to kill those sons of fear for Vivian. A night passed just like that. When dawn broke, Soren took out a long sword and began to practice the White Raven sword art. Combat skills were honed by oneself bit by bit. If he wanted to master such a high-level combat skill, he still needed to put in a lot of effort. Talents could enhance the speed of mastering combat skills, but it could not directly let you obtain the combat skills. Rogues were not impulsive people. Soren was not a reckless idiot. He needed more planning and more strength. An hour later, he finished practicing the White Raven sword art. His slow movements looked a little awkward and there was no handsome look to it. It was as if one movement was split into dozens of movements. It looked very stiff and there was no smooth and handsome look at all. The White Raven sword art was second only to the cross sword art. It was cool, arrogant, and sharp. It could only be said that Soren really put in a lot of effort in practicing it, because he learned the military version of the White Raven sword art. The owner of the inn got up and watched for a while. Then she boiled a basin of hot water and brought it to him. Soren thanked her and washed his body. His muscles looked like they were made of steel. She could not help but take a second look at him. There were many people in this era who had a strong body. Their muscles were much more exaggerated than Soren's, but there were very few people who were as well proportioned and strong as him. Especially the small muscles on his body. Although the owner of the inn did not know much about them, she knew that only powerful adventurers had them. This represented a kind of explosive power and a strong sense of balance. Rogues rarely had large muscles. They looked thin, but when they took off their clothes, you would find that their whole body was obviously filled with small muscles. Their combat skills were based on their sense of balance. When they moved, they did not only have large muscles on their chest, arms, and legs. The more they pursued balance, the more obvious their small muscles would be. The more they pursued strength, the more exaggerated their large muscles would be. The typical example of this was the barbarians. Their large muscles on their arms were as thick as a human's leg. This represented the main focus of their strength training. The latter could be seen at a glance, but the former could only be seen in battle. Soren simply washed up, ate something, and went to the blacksmith's shop. He wanted to see the progress of the curved sword. A good weapon was more important than other rare equipment. Killing. Mainly relying on the sword. Chapter 125. The smithy was bustling with activity. The elven blacksmith's eyes were bloodshot, but his face was filled with excitement. He ordered his apprentices to work and increased the temperature of the furnace from time to time. There were all kinds of rare materials on the side, but not all of them were rare-grade items. Most of them were just rare minerals. Forging wasn't something that could be done by directly embedding or simply mixing them together. It could be done with a spell. Forging in this world was a very advanced process, and it was definitely one of the most difficult skills to master. In some ways it was even more sci-fi than forging in the interstellar era. The special materials were used as tools similar to carburizing catalysts. The rare minerals were used to add small amounts of other elements during hammering, similar to spring steel. The holy water on the side was used as a core material for secondary quenching. There were also some other rare items that Soren didn't know about. The rare-grade weapons in this world were hammered out one by one. Spells were only the later enchantments. The equipment in the abyss of hell was also forged using volcanic furnaces. Soren looked at it and realized that he wasn't very good at it. The elven blacksmith hammered the metal with a strange rhythm. After hammering for 100 times, he sprinkled some ground powder and repeated the hammering process. The elements of the mineral powder would seep into the fish scale pattern steel, and the impurities would be removed during the hammering process. Only after 100 times of hammering could a rare-grade weapon be called a rare-grade weapon. Only then could a rare-grade weapon be undamaged in an intense battle. Without rare materials like adamantine and mithril, this was the only way to achieve the best results. This type of steel ingot existed in ancient times as well. It was called wrought iron in the Central Plains, wood steel in some areas, and Damascus steel ingot in some places. Its forging process was similar to the elves' fish scale pattern steel ingot and the dwarves' titan steel ingot. There were very few people in the world who could afford to use rare materials like mithril and adamantine to forge. Usually, half of the country's resources were used to do so. Therefore, most of the time, these special ingots were used to forge. But for some reason, Soren was a little excited when he saw how focused the elven blacksmith was on forging. He had a strong feeling that the weapon he was going to forge this time wouldn't just be a rare grade 1 item. It was possible that the extreme effect of ordinary iron forging would appear. There were a few blacksmiths who could forge ordinary iron with the same effect as adamantine. Soren felt that the elven blacksmith in front of him probably had more than 200 points in forging skill. Judging from his 100-fold steel forging technique and his concentration while forging, it was possible that the elven blacksmith had close to 300 points in forging skill. The other party might be a blacksmith close to the level of a master blacksmith. The only flaw was that he did not learn alchemy. He probably didn't even know that he was close to the level of a master because it seemed that he had been forging in this village for many years. His skills had been stacked with time. Soren stayed for a while before leaving. He didn't disturb the focused elven blacksmith at all. The other party seemed to be in a state of madness. His expression was rather fanatical. He probably also felt that his skill was about to reach a breakthrough point. After decades of smithing, he had never thought that he would reach a critical point because of an order for a transcendent weapon. Soren returned to the inn and began to study magic. The more spell nodes and spell circuits he mastered, the faster he could learn other spells in the future, and the easier it would be for him to comprehend high-level spells. A master blacksmith's weapon was basically the limit for a mortal's weapon. Above that was magic enchantment as well as the very sci-fi elemental collapse. Everything had a lot of space. Atoms and molecules had a lot of space, and protons and electrons had even more space. Elemental collapse was the collapse of these spaces. The Arcane Empire had a lot of in-depth research on this, because the strongest neutron star golem in the legends was made of elemental collapse. Soren once found some strange ores at the edge of the abyss, which was the point of contact between the plane and space. They were only the size of a fingernail, but they could weigh up to 3 kilograms. This was the elemental collapse material, and it was also an important material for legendary weapons. The weapons made were almost indestructible. It was also the only material that could resist supernatural magic enchantment. In the later stages of purebred warriors, after entering the legendary realm, they would forge their own exclusive weapon. This elemental collapse material was the core material for their weapon forging. Until now, there was still a battle axe in the abyss, and even the 100-armed giant couldn't pull it out. If Soren remembered correctly, its strength should be around 45 points. This strength was enough to move mountains and fill oceans. In the underwater ruins, there was a document that recorded part of the neutron star golem's data. It was only 5 meters tall, and its size was similar to a steel golem. It weighed 300,000 tons, and it was almost immune to all physical and magical attacks. In the entire Arcane Empire, there was only one neutron star golem. Because of some mistakes, a piece of the continental shelf sank, and in the end the neutron star golem disappeared completely. Only in the legendary golem craftwork would there be some records about the neutron star golem. Soren would definitely go to the abyss in the future. This was because the materials he needed to forge supernatural weapons could only be found in places like the abyss, and the elemental collapse material could directly block many magic attacks. This was because even magic attacks couldn't penetrate it. Time passed little by little. Soren was very patient. Every day he would practice the White Raven Sword style regularly, and then he would learn the structure of spells. Occasionally he would also practice his casting skills. He had a feeling that he would soon master the ability, spell control. The innkeeper's attitude towards him was a lot friendlier. On one hand it was because of Kindler, and on the other hand it was probably because she was more familiar with him. She didn't think that he was a dangerous person. In fact, Soren looked very handsome. As long as he wasn't in a state of battle, he would look like a quiet scholar. The elven blacksmith's eyes were getting more and more bloodshot, and he was getting more and more excited. Soren was even asked to buy more than 100 Kindler's special materials. It was an unknown material that was refined using divine spells and alchemy. It was an unknown material used to forge holy weapons. Anyway, even if he didn't know what it was, Soren still bought it without hesitation. This was because his custom-made curved sword was almost finished. 3 days passed quickly. The elven blacksmith didn't sleep much. His eyes were bloodshot, and 2 of his apprentices had already collapsed from exhaustion. When Soren arrived on the 4th day, the elven blacksmith finally showed a smile. Clang. A curved sword that was covered with tiny fish scales appeared in front of Soren. The hilt was very simple, and it didn't look like the style of an elven weapon. There were only faint patterns on the hilt, and it looked like the unique mark of a blacksmith. The elven blacksmith had already opened the blade overnight. He looked at Soren and smiled happily. Then he swung the sword at the iron felt next to the furnace. Clang. A corner of the iron felt was cut off, and the thickness of the cut was close to 5 centimeters. The elven blacksmith didn't seem to use too much strength, and he was able to cut off a corner of the iron felt. There wasn't a single scratch on the snow-white blade, and it looked just like how it was before. Armor break. Soren's pupils shrank and his expression changed. He quickly walked over to the elven blacksmith. Ha ha ha. The elven blacksmith laughed hysterically, and then he held the curved sword in his hand in front of Soren. Soren took the curved sword with a solemn expression, and then slightly bowed to show his respect. It was really the ultimate forging of ordinary iron. Only the armor break attribute could achieve such an effect. This was already close to the strongest grade 1 weapon. Item type, curved sword +1, unenchanted, item grade, rare, grade 1. Item description, a weapon made from 100-fold forged steel. Other materials were mixed into it during the forging process. It was made from the Elven clan's fish scale steel ingot, and it underwent a second quenching process. All attributes of this weapon exceed that of other weapons. Equipment requirements, 12 strength or above. Equipment effects, fish scale steel ingot, +3 sharpness, +3 penetration, +1 toughness, +1 armor break. Soren's expression was a little excited. He stretched out his finger and gently stroked the curved sword's delicate body. He could feel the tiny fish scales rubbing against his fingertips. Soren lifted his finger and lightly flicked the blade. He could hear a crisp sound as if it had a trace of magic. He couldn't help but murmur, "This sword is qualified to be used to slay a dragon." The elven blacksmith's tired eyes suddenly lit up, and he excitedly said, "That's right. It can definitely break through the dragon scales of a pure-blood dragon. That's why I named it Dragon Slayer." Soren was suddenly stunned. As the one who forged this curved sword, the elven blacksmith in front of him did indeed have the right to name it. But this name was a bit of a pain in the ass, right? He suddenly wanted to slap his own mouth. Chapter 126. The blacksmith fell to the ground as soon as he finished his sentence. The others were shocked. Soren thought that the blacksmith had died from exhaustion, but the blacksmith soon started snoring. He waved his hand at the apprentices next to him, signaling them to move the blacksmith to the bed and leave a dozen kindlers by the furnace. The apprentices were exhausted after 3 days of hard work. Their eyes were bloodshot and they looked very tired. Soren was very satisfied with the result, so he didn't mind giving them a small tip. Dragon Slayer. Soren stroked the blade and curled his lips. This name is too inauspicious. Let's just call it Laceration. There were a lot of equipment called Dragon Slayer in this world. For example, there was a Dragon Slayer sword in Whiterun City. Any equipment with this name that succeeded in slaying a dragon seemed to carry a curse. Their owners would often die in the hands of dragons. Soren didn't have much of a hobby when it came to slaying dragons. Only when it was necessary to do something that involved the dragon race would he not hesitate to slay them. Laceration was a rare weapon he once got. Although it wasn't as good as the one in front of him, it was quite similar in all aspects. Although this scimitar was only a grade 1 rare weapon, its attributes were already at grade 2. It didn't have any energy damage, but its sharpness and penetration were quite high. Gloria's enchanted weapon only added 2 points, but this scimitar already had 3 points of sharpness and penetration. To put it simply, this scimitar could break through natural armor with +3 defense. The most famous example of this was the Drake. The Drake's natural defense was its dragon skin, which gave it +3 defense. The last 2 attributes were the key. Toughness was a characteristic of elven weapons, and it definitely wouldn't break easily. Armor break was usually an additional attribute added by adamantine. It was very useful against dragons, demons, and liches. As long as it was a weapon with armor break, it would be able to break through dragon scales. It was also very effective against warriors with full body armor. Other than the full body armor that was hard to break, the other scales and chainmail could be broken through with 1 or 2 slashes. Since the weapon had been forged, Soren naturally didn't need to continue staying here. He had almost recovered from his injuries 2 days ago. In these 2 days he had also studied about 70% of the Charm Person's spell. Charm spells were more difficult to learn compared to other spells. Soren went to the inn to pay the bill and gave 1 or 2 kindler coins as a tip. Then he went directly to the outside of the village. His arrival did not alarm too many people, and his departure was not noticed by many either. Adventurers were a group of travelers, and they would only stop when they were tired. In the lush green forest. After entering the wilderness, Soren's vigilance began to rise. He was now going all the way north along the elven forest, which might be thousands of kilometers away. There was an icebound valley on the edge of the Frost Kingdom. After passing through this valley he would enter the Ice Kingdom. It used to be a big battlefield with many sunken underground ruins. What separated the North and the Ice Kingdom was a snow mountain range that stretched for hundreds of miles. Because of the special geography, the two had become 2 completely different worlds. Soren moved forward at a very fast speed. His extraordinary 20 points of constitution ensured that he could keep moving forward at a slow pace. As long as he didn't exceed the range of physical consumption, his recovery speed was almost the same as the speed of consumption. In just one morning, Soren had walked dozens of kilometers. The surrounding scenery had changed a lot. The trees in front of him were basically as thick as 3 people hugging together. These trees were at least hundreds of years old. This was the characteristic of the elven hinterland. The deeper he went, the older the trees were, and the more likely he would meet the legendary beautiful dryads. In other words, the spiritual embodiment of nature. Soren's footsteps suddenly stopped. He frowned and pulled out a piece of rag with his hand. The cloth was very smooth to the touch and there were traces of blood on it. There should have been a battle in this location, and it should have happened in the last 3 days. The footprints on the ground were blurred, but he still judged the direction of the battle based on his intuition. He followed the tracks for 100 or 200 meters, and then saw the obvious traces of a battle. There were broken branches cut by swords and very dense footprints. There was indeed a battle here. Soren observed for a while and was ready to leave. He was concerned about whether there would be an ambush ahead. He had no interest in these occasional battles because battles happened too frequently in this world. In an instant, suddenly Suoran's figure paused for a moment. Then he turned around and went behind a big tree. He seemed to have seen something in that split second. What appeared in front of him was a mark on a big tree. It was 5-inch deep claw marks. It was obvious that the attacker was very strong, and there was a dried blood stain on the tree trunk. Soren's expression instantly turned cold. His face was a little ferocious, and the murderous aura on his face was extremely strong. He stretched out his palm and gestured at the 5 claw marks on the tree, then slowly pressed it on his back. There were still 5 shallow red marks on his back. Even though the priests had used healing spells, they couldn't completely erase the scars left behind by that vicious attack. Soren silently held his curved sword in his hand, and then his figure gradually became blurred and finally disappeared into the shadows. That group of hunters. They didn't give up on the hunting ritual, and in the last 3 days they had also killed another target. Soren would never mistake the 5 claw marks. The dark high-grade gnoll almost killed him there. The killing intent in his heart made Soren thirst for blood. His injuries had basically healed, and the special abilities of the Shadow Dancer were all available. Soren, who had just obtained a rare grade weapon, was ready to use the blood of these hunters as a sacrifice to his blade. Soren was not afraid of the number of enemies when he was alone. Because he was a rogue, the shadows and the forest were his best cover. His figure disappeared, and the power of the shadows covered his traces. Only when he walked on the bright ground could he see a blurry figure. This was because the level of sneak was not high enough. It required more than 200 points of sneak to become invisible in places without shadows. But this didn't matter much to Soren. He didn't put most of his skill points into sneak, which meant that he strengthened his other combat abilities. The wizard's invisibility could completely replace the effect of sneak when necessary. Looks like there are more than 20 of them. Soren stopped and looked at the ground. The footprints on the ground were messy, but he could see that it was a circular encirclement. It didn't look like it was left behind by an attack, but more like it was left behind by someone retreating. He pulled out the grass in front of him, and there was a piece of cloth left behind by the thorns. The texture and cloth were similar to the ones in front of him, but the pattern was somewhat familiar. He murmured, "Where have I seen this pattern before?" He identified the direction and continued to follow the tracks. Rogues were also good at tracking, otherwise they wouldn't have been able to reproduce the advanced profession of bounty hunter and assassin. Soren walked for about 1 or 2 kilometers and stopped in front of another big tree. There were 3 claw marks on it, and there were broken branches and shrubs nearby. He could hear the sound of a river in front of him. Looks like there was a fight here for a while. Soren reached out his hand and picked up the soil on the ground. It was dark red soil and the area was not small. Although the body was gone, there should be a person here. Judging from the blood stains, the person should have died on the spot. There was obviously someone in front of him who used a sword to cut down the shrubs blocking the way. It seemed like the person they surrounded was not good at fighting or he was weak, so the person protecting him had to clear the way and cut down the shrubs that were blocking his movement. Looks like they're dead. Soren only saw the traces of one person's death, but according to his estimation, the person shouldn't be able to run away. If he had to protect such a burden, he would not be able to escape the hunter's pursuit. He lost track of them by the river. There were no footprints on the other side, so it seemed like the person didn't cross the river. Soren walked along the river bank and soon found a new clue. He found a weapon and a torn piece of armor. An elven rapier? Soren picked up the broken rapier and looked around. He muttered to himself, "Could it be the elven noble I met the other day?" His guards seemed to be equipped with this kind of equipment. No wonder they looked so familiar. Normal elven patrol guards couldn't afford such expensive cloth. Does that mean that guy met the hunters? It should have happened 3 days ago. Soren met an elven noble in front of the Temple of Life in the village. He had a part of the elven queen's bloodline, and it seemed like he was a descendant of the divine blood. They must have met the hunters and for some reason they became the new target. What happened next was a battle to escape. His guards definitely couldn't beat a group of high-grade hunters. If I want to catch up, it should be in front. Soren's pupils shrank. His figure once again disappeared into the shadows, and then he sneaked towards the foot of the mountain in front of him. There were more mountains in the elven forest, but they weren't high. The terrain was hilly. According to Soren's estimation, the elven guards would at most cover the foot of the mountain in front of him, and then the hunters would catch up to them. The distance between them was getting closer and closer. Soren suddenly stopped. He pulled out his curved sword and his footsteps became lighter. There were still traces in front of him. The traces were very obvious. There were at least 10 people moving around, and they should have been left behind today. He could also vaguely hear some voices. It seemed like there were people in front of him and the number was more than 10. P.S. The second update will be a little later. Chapter 127. Soren didn't dare to get too close to it. The hunters had anti-tracking abilities and the gnolls had a good sense of smell. They could smell the scent of a living person if they got too close to it. Soren's figure was completely shrouded in the shadows, and there were no traces of him at all. He was moving in the shadows, and there was no way he would expose himself in a place without shadows. The distance between them was getting closer and closer. Soren was moving very slowly and there were almost no footsteps. There was a gray hair near the bushes, and it didn't notice Soren even when he passed by it about a meter away. It was still busy eating something. There were traces of a bonfire in front of him, and it seemed that the hunters had spent the night here. There were also skinned beast carcasses nearby. They must have killed a wild boar last night, and there was still half of the boar's head left uneaten. A hybrid orc appeared in front of him. It looked at the foot of the mountain with a fierce expression, and it was rubbing its battle axe in its hand. % and at #% *. Soren couldn't understand what it was saying at all. It seemed to be the hybrid orc's dialect and there was a little bit of pure orc language in it. This language couldn't be understood without learning it. He could only guess from its facial expressions and movements. The hybrid orc seemed to be angry, and it kept pointing at the foot of the mountain as if it wanted to attack. The number of hunters had decreased a lot. Soren saw the dark high-grade gnoll. There was a sword wound on its face and it was staring at the hybrid orc coldly. It seemed that they hadn't finished the hunt. Something must have happened. Soren moved forward in the shadows, and went around 100 or 2 meters to the foot of the mountain. His expression gradually became serious, and the vegetation on the ground seemed too strong. He reached out and picked up a vine and murmured, "What is this? Entanglement? No. It doesn't look like a simple spell effect. The power of a spell wouldn't last that long." Everything in front of him had obviously lasted for 2 or 3 days, and the plants were full of vitality for some reason. Droll? Soren approached the mountain bit by bit, and found that the foot of the mountain had become a sea of plants. There were green vines everywhere and these plants seemed to have come alive. They swayed gently with the wind, and he could vaguely see signs of unreasonable activity. The exuberant plants were like a barrier blocking the holes in all directions. Fresh blood could be seen in some places. The thorns on the vines had pierced into the bodies of some creatures, using their blood to maintain their existence. However, there were also signs of withering near the edges. Is this a living plant? Or did it change with divine power? Soren slowly pulled out his curved sword, not daring to get close to the vines that were obviously too vigorous. This kind of thing was definitely difficult to deal with. Even legendary rogues might be trapped in it if they were unlucky. Looking at the corpses inside the vines, they were definitely the corpses of high-grade hunters. At least 6 of them with a profession level of 15 or above had died in the vines. It seemed that they also tried to attack with fire, but these supernatural vines were not afraid of fire at all. Soren saw the figures of the elven guards. The number had decreased a lot. Only 3 of them were still standing. There were 4 or 5 lying on the ground next to them. It seemed that many of them had died. The handsome elven nobleman was still there, but he looked very embarrassed. There were 3 claw marks on his face and his eyebrows were cut open. His face looked particularly ferocious. Judging from the wound, the nobleman was almost attacked in the temple. It doesn't look like a burst of divine power. Is it because of some legendary item? Soren stared at the elven nobleman in the distance. His expression was a little desperate. They had been trapped here for nearly 3 days. Most of his guards had died and the rest were basically injured. They were obviously trapped here by the hunters, and only supported by the vines outside for so long. Time passed little by little. The despair on the elven nobleman's face became more and more obvious. The guard said something in his ear, but it was too far away to hear clearly. These vines could not last forever. If no one came to rescue them, These people would definitely die in the hands of the hunters. The sky was getting darker and darker. Soren quietly landed from the tree trunk and slowly moved forward along the shadows. Rogues were very patient, and Soren was even more patient. He was not in a hurry to attack, nor did he do anything that would expose his existence. He was like a bystander, always watching the movements of the group of people at the foot of the mountain, maintaining a distance of about 100 or 200 meters. Although the hunters were constantly arguing, they were still vigilant. Soren was sure that he could kill them in one shot, but he was not sure if he could retreat after attacking. He also did not approach the elves. First of all, Soren did not have the ability to help them get out of danger. Second, they might not trust him. He was not enthusiastic enough to risk his life to help someone who had nothing to do with him. There were 12 hunters in this group. Half of them were around professional level 12, and the other half were all high-grade professions with professional level 15 and above. Half of them were mixed orcs. Although the high-grade gnoll was very strong, its voice seemed to have been weakened a lot. The hunters were roasting meat. They had sent someone to hunt a goat. Some people tried to get close to the vines, but when they saw the dancing thorns, they immediately retreated. They seemed to be very scared. Soren sat on a tree and looked at the bonfire in the distance. He then turned to the shadows at the foot of the mountain and took out a piece of dried meat to chew. At this time, it was a competition of patience. The most important thing in hunting was patience. Night fell. The hunters basically did not sleep. They silently surrounded the bonfire. Their continuous failure to interrupt the ritual had made them frustrated and angry. The mixed orcs were picking their teeth with a dagger and looking behind them with hatred. Soren heard a slight noise from the vines, but before he could do anything, the high-grade gnoll sneered. It quietly lurked and slowly approached in the night. The other hunters looked at each other but did not move. Instead, they slightly raised their voices. An elven guard lurked out. The vines seemed to be controlled and did not attack him. After he left the range of the vines, he quietly sneaked out. It seemed that he was a ranger. The people in the vines were obviously watching him nervously. Soren's dark vision was already in effect. Night was not much different today for him. The shadow dancer was an advanced profession that was very suitable for night activities. Swoosh. Just when the elven guard thought that he had escaped and wanted to speed up to report, a black shadow suddenly rushed out from behind the bushes. With a flash of cold light, the gnoll's sharp claws directly pierced into the elven guard's abdomen. The gnoll grabbed the elven guard's neck with its palm and then lifted him up. When the gnoll pulled out its right claw, blood and intestines spilled out. A terrible scream was heard. The vines were strangely silent, and then someone's angry roar was heard. The gnoll picked up the elven guard with a grim smile and then walked towards the bonfire. Two strong mixed-blood orcs stood up and looked at each other fiercely. Then a cruel smile appeared on their faces. They directly skewered the elven guard, who was still alive, with wooden sticks, and then roasted him on the bonfire. An extremely miserable wail rang out. The face of the elven nobles in the vines was as white as a sheet of paper. The remaining elven guards were also pale. Soren put down the jerky. He suddenly felt that he really did not have much of an appetite. He silently put away the dry food. The faint screams were still intermittently heard. He held his curved sword tightly and stayed where he was. He looked up at the sky. It was still early. The time before dawn was the time when people were the most relaxed. Even high-grade professions would feel a little tired during this time. The screams from the bonfire were getting weaker and weaker. Soren looked over there expressionlessly. His hand holding the curved sword was a little pale because he used too much strength. There was a smell of meat in the air. But when the smell drifted out, the elven nobles in the vines suddenly vomited. He vomited until tears and snot came out. He looked very embarrassed. The hunters laughed ferociously. The mixed-blood orcs picked up the corpse, tore off a leg and threw it into the vines. They also said something loudly, which seemed to mean that the roasted meat was delicious and they could eat it now. One of the elven guards wanted to rush out as if he had gone crazy, but he was stopped by another person. Because going out would be suicide. The elven nobles were completely paralyzed on the spot. His expression was a little nervous because the roasted leg was thrown in front of him. As a noble, he had probably never experienced something like this. This was the real survival in the wilderness. Soren was very quiet. His figure was invisible in the darkness. He kept paying attention to the bonfire and occasionally looked up at the sky. It was almost dawn. The elves in the vines were almost on the verge of collapse. The hunters' methods were not something these pampered fellows could withstand. Some of the mixed-blood orcs were sleeping, but some were on guard. Night. The high-ranking Jacqueline's eyes were green, and it had been watching the nearby movements. However, as time passed, it also gently closed its eyes. They had been surrounding this place for almost 3 days, and it also needed a little rest. The power of magic was declining. They found that some of the vines had withered. It would not take long for these damn vines to disappear. Soren watched silently. Although the high-tier Jack-Allen had closed its eyes, it was still squatting on the ground. It could rush out in an instant. It was not asleep. It just closed its eyes and took a nap. Time passed by minute by minute. Some of the mixed-blood orcs were already snoring. The vigilant hunters looked slightly tired. The gnoll's posture was also slightly tilted. Soren's expressionless face finally showed a trace of emotion. He narrowed his eyes slightly, pulled out his curved sword, and then slowly approached in an arc. Bit by bit, he got closer. Chapter 128. The distance between them was getting closer and closer. Night was the best cover for a rogue. Soren couldn't see any traces under the moonlight. Even when he moved, he only left very faint footprints. Perfect stealth required a combination of spells and spell-like abilities. In addition to greater invisibility, it also required a combination of greater lighten, greater haste, and so on. Soren didn't meet such conditions for the time being, but with his strength, he wouldn't be easily discovered by the enemy. It was already the time before dawn. The vigilant hunters were a little relaxed and narrowed the range of their vigilance. 200 meters, 150 meters, 100 meters. When Soren closed the distance to about 80 or 90 meters, he slowly stopped. Then his figure strangely disappeared. He didn't hide in the shadows, but activated shadow jump and directly crossed into the shadow plane. The scenery in front of him was still gray. Even at night, the moonlight was gray. The shadow plane seemed to be unchanging and dead. A short second, but it left a very deep impression. The next moment, the shadow of the high-grade gnoll twisted. The dancing bonfire in front of it made its shadow look like an evil spirit with fangs and claws. Then it turned into a hazy figure. At the same time, a curved sword with a cold light pierced its back. The white scales on the blade reflected light. The moment it pierced the heart of the high-grade gnoll, it also alarmed the other hunters. A row of data appeared in front of Soren. Activated dark vision. Activated shadow jump. Activated shadow strike. Shadow jump successful. Activated shadow jump crossplane ability. Shadow strike successful. You've received 9 shadow damage. Activated backstab. You've dealt 154 piercing damage to the target. Everything happened in an instant. The hunters who were awakened by the sword rushed over. When the high-grade gnoll opened its eyes, there was already a curved sword in its chest, directly piercing its heart. However, it didn't die immediately. On the contrary, a blood-red light appeared in its eyes. It roared crazily as all the muscles on its body swelled up. It swung its claws at Soren's throat. Soren's face was sliced open by the sharp claws, but it only left a shallow cut. Soren had already retreated the moment his claws landed on his enemy. The scimitar was pulled out on the spot. Blood gushed out like a fountain, and the figure of the high-ranking Jack-Allen stiffened for a moment. Then with a roar it rushed over. It looked like it wanted to die together with him. Soren didn't stop at all. Even if he couldn't kill the enemy in one hit, he quickly disappeared into the shadows and activated evade sight. Soren entered stealth. The high-grade gnoll seemed to have gone crazy. It attacked everything in front of it. A mixed-blood orc who rushed too close was directly cut open by its claws. There was a slight commotion around the campfire. The other hunters looked at the blood gushing out of the gnoll's chest and couldn't do anything. No one even dared to get too close to it. It was obvious that the gnoll had gone crazy. The nearby bushes and trees were cut down by its claws. The high-grade gnoll's blood-red eyes searched for its enemy's target. Its chest was completely covered in blood. Rewind time to 1 second ago. When Soren's sword hit the gnoll, there was no kill notification in front of his eyes. His heart skipped a beat. He immediately gave up on the idea of killing it and quickly retreated. High fortitude? Or legendary fortitude? Soren felt a slight pain on the side of his face. He knew that the enemy's claws had scratched his face. After distancing himself for about 10 meters, he immediately activated evade sight and disappeared into the shadows. As a veteran adventurer, Soren was sure that he had stabbed the gnoll's heart. If the gnoll's heart didn't trigger the test of lethal damage, then there could only be one result. The gnoll had high fortitude, or even legendary fortitude. It was a purebred melee profession that was close to level 18. Its physical strength was close to supernatural. The distance between them was about 50 meters. All the hunters had woken up. They looked around with vigilance and uneasiness. The high-grade gnoll was still standing on the ground. Its crazy and bloodthirsty eyes were trying to find Soren's trace. A lot of blood was gushing out of its chest. Some people tried to get close to it and heal it. However, without the divine spells of a high-grade priest, it was impossible to heal such a serious injury by relying on medicine alone. More and more blood gushed out. The high-grade gnoll's feet were covered in blood. Its eyes were getting crazier and weaker. Finally, after being stabbed in the heart by Soren, it still held on for 5 or 6 minutes. Only then did the gnoll's blood run dry. It fell to the ground with a roar full of unwillingness. A notification appeared in front of him. Target killed. Extracting soul energy. You've received 5200 slaughter EXP. Soren returned to the shadows. He wandered around the hunters and looked at the high-grade gnoll on the ground in front of him. He was surprised. What a high fortitude. In his memory, other than those legendary realm warriors, there were only a few creatures that could counterattack after their hearts were pierced. Perhaps only a few creatures with abnormal vitality could do so. The high-grade gnoll that was just listed as the first target didn't trigger the test of lethal damage when its heart was stabbed. It probably didn't have many fatal points on its body. If he wanted to kill it in one blow, he could only use a beheading attack unless he pierced the brain. High-grade melee professions could train to have extremely high fortitude. Soren had seen a legendary melee profession with legendary fortitude and absolute fortitude. After his heart was taken out, he still fought for nearly 10 minutes. He relied on his explosive power to kill a large number of enemies at the last moment of his life. If a high-grade priest could cast a level 9, Greater Restoration, spell on him during this period of time, then his heart could be restored by divine spells. The profession level of the high-grade gnoll was close to 18, and its HP was estimated to be close to 300 points. Soren's attack didn't trigger the test of lethal damage, so it only caused about 150 points of damage to it. Although it didn't kill it on the spot, the bleeding damage and the damage to its internal organs caused its HP to continuously decrease. Even with the high vitality of a high-grade warrior, it couldn't last long under such serious bleeding and internal injuries. The god of the hunt had already taken back the divine spells it gave. Without a priest with a profession level of 15 or above to cast restoration, even if it was seriously injured, it could only last a little longer. Its vitality was rapidly depleting and eventually, its HP was completely exhausted. Although Soren killed the most dangerous high-grade gnoll among the hunters, he didn't feel much excitement in his heart because the strength of the enemies in front of him was beyond his estimation. He simply didn't have the ability to kill all of them. In this attack, these enemies had already been alerted. They shortened the distance between each other and expanded their vigilance range at the same time, basically cutting off his chance of a sneak attack. Shadow Jump had already been activated. Without this supernatural ability to cross planes, it would be very difficult for him to sneak over and backstab them. If he killed an enemy, he would be surrounded by other hunters. However, Soren didn't just leave. He was a very patient rogue, and his killing intent towards the enemies in front of him was firm enough. He once again lurked around, silently waiting for a new opportunity. As long as these hunters continued to hold the ritual, he could wait for a new opportunity. For Soren, who had already surpassed grade 3, this kind of opportunity was enough for him to kill an enemy. The light of dawn gradually emerged. The hunters didn't dare to act rashly. To deal with a rogue who was proficient in stealth, acting rashly would only expose them to danger. They were waiting for dawn, and only after dawn would they be able to find traces of the rogue. The mixed-blood orc was angrily cursing, as if roaring that it would pull out the tendons and skin the enemy when it found them. But now it was still very dark. No matter how angry it was, this guy didn't dare to be more than 15 steps away from the others. As long as it went beyond this distance, it was likely to be attacked by a high-grade rogue because there were too many shadows nearby. The light in the sky was getting brighter and brighter. Soren increased the distance to more than 200 meters. Because with the arrival of the day, his stealth ability was also weakened, and this group of hunters was likely to disperse into small groups to find his trace. A rogue absolutely couldn't fight against more than 3 enemies with a similar profession level. Suddenly, just as Soren was about to continue to increase the distance, the hunters in front of him let out an excited roar, and then saw them rushing to the foot of the mountain. There were a lot of vines growing there, but now they began to wither in large patches. The power contained in them had been exhausted, and these vines, which were born from the mysterious power, quickly died. A loud eagle cry sounded. The hunter's movements were a little slower. Soren also looked up at the sky and he saw the figure of Droll. There were cries of joy coming from the vines. After 3 days, finally Droll found them. The mixed-blood orc roared, and then without hesitation they rushed to the vines. They wanted to kill the target before Droll got close. Swoosh! A sharp arrow shot at the mixed-blood orc at the front, and then a vigorous figure jumped directly from a height of hundreds of meters. It was a very beautiful and tall female elf. There was a crescent moon emblem on her exquisite armor. This emblem made everyone's face change. Soren also stopped. His expression was a little hesitant, and then he took a deep breath and suddenly rushed into the vines in stealth. A shadow flew out. He knocked out the elven nobleman in the vines with a swing of his hand, and then quickly searched around. Chapter 129. The Knight in Silver. When he saw the figure falling from the sky, Soren realized that the identity of the elven noble was more complicated than he thought. To be able to make a quasi-legendary profession who served the Lady of the Silver Moon come to save him, he probably had the blood of the elven royal family. So Soren made a very bold decision in an instant, and that was to rob the other party. The elven noble must have a legendary item on him, otherwise the mutated vines would not have been able to stop the hunters for 3 days. Soren's speed was extremely fast. As an experienced thief, after knocking the elven noble unconscious, he quickly took out a multidimensional bag from the noble's body, as well as a leaf that looked green and lustrous. However, it seemed to be something extraordinary that was kept close to the noble's body. After Soren got these 2 things, he wanted to escape, but suddenly a cold light flew from a distance. Swoosh! Soren let out a scream. The hand holding the multidimensional bag was shot by a sharp arrow, and half of the arrow penetrated his palm. The multidimensional bag fell directly to the ground. The arrow's angle was very tricky, and at the moment he was shot, he was unable to hold on to the bag. In the distance, the knight in silver dodged the attack of the mixed-blood orc, and then with a cold expression, she put an arrow on her bow and aimed at Soren again. As a quasi-legendary profession, the knight in silver had the combat ability of a ranger, and could also use the high-level divine spells of a priest. It was an advanced profession that was naturally close to the legendary level. A Droll's figure fell from the sky. At the moment when the elven longbow was aimed at him, Soren's back also had goosebumps. He did not hesitate to pick up the unconscious elven noble, and then directly put him in front of himself. The knight in silver's expression was indeed hesitant. She twisted her body and shot a hunter in the arm, and then sprinted toward Soren's position. The speed of the opponent's sprint was very amazing, almost leaving behind afterimages. It was simply a supernatural ability. Soren took a deep breath and did not bother to pick up the multidimensional bag on the ground. He quickly put the strange green leaf into his arms. Then he gritted his teeth and threw the elven noble in his hand away. Then he flew towards the shadows. The knight in silver hesitated for a moment, but still reached out to catch the elven noble. After checking his breath and finding that he had just fainted, she suddenly raised her longbow to block an attack from behind. She seemed to want to keep Soren here, but he was nowhere to be seen. Evade sight. As soon as Soren entered the shadows, he activated evade sight for the last time. After entering stealth, he quickly retreated without looking back. The Droll who had just landed was also a high-tier spell caster. The knight in silver's skill was superb. She could even shoot an arrow while blocking the opponent's attack. Her slender figure seemed to be dancing in a strange way, and any attack missed her by a little bit. This was a very clever dodging skill which was close to the legendary dodge ability. She alone blocked 5 or 6 hunters. The roar of a wild beast resounded. After the Droll landed, the weeds on the ground began to grow wildly, blocking the hunters who rushed in front of him for more than 10 seconds. Then a huge brown bear appeared out of thin air. It roared and pounced forward, raising its bare claws. A mixed-blood orc with more than 20 points of strength was slapped until he spat out blood. There was a hideous claw mark on his chest, and all his ribs were caved in. The ferocious brown bear let out a low roar. It weighed more than a ton, and under its tough fur was a thick layer of fat and muscle. After being scratched by the hunters, it seemed to be completely fine. This was a brown bear with a monster level of more than 15. It might be an animal companion cultivated by the wild Droll. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. Soren's figure leaped in the dense forest. After more than a kilometer away, he stopped for a moment. He gritted his teeth and broke the arrow in his palm, then pulled out the arrowhead that penetrated his palm little by little. A hole was directly shot in his palm. If he was shot in other parts, he was afraid that it would have gone through his body. The knights in silver who served the Lady of the Silver Moon were very difficult to deal with. They were similar to the existence of the low-grade chosen and had additional power given by the gods. The Lady of the Silver Moon's faith was spread across many races, and the elves were also one of her main sources of believers. His palm trembled slightly. Soren gritted his teeth and applied some potions, then sneaked forward again. A knight in silver and a high-grade droll, it would not be easy for the hunters to kill the elven noble. The strength of the two sides was not much different because most of the people who could advance into the knights in silver were professions with a total level of 18 or above. Even if they had not entered the realm of legends, they would not be too far away. Soren must take advantage of the time to open up enough distance and then find a way to completely get rid of the other party. The knights in silver had the ability of a ranger, and they were not much worse than a rogue in tracking. Soren fled all the way. After opening up a distance of more than 20 kilometers, he took a little rest and took out the strange green leaf. If this was not a legendary equipment, it would not be worth it for him to take such a big risk to grab it. The knights in silver were famous for being vengeful. Most of them were female elves with a long lifespan and a good memory. Offending them was easy to get revenge and be hunted down for a long time. Soren tried to identify the item, but a row of data unexpectedly appeared. Appraisal failed. Do you want to use soul energy to identify the item? Appraisal will cost 3,000 soul energy. How is this possible? There was a hint of shock on Soren's face, followed by a pleasantly surprised expression. He had successfully appraised the legendary item, Elemental Stone, Earth, in an instant, but the green leaf in front of him actually failed. Moreover, it required a full 3,000 slaughter EXP to appraise. This was something that had never happened before in his memory. Could it be that the leaf he had grabbed had exceeded the level of a legendary item? That was impossible. Above the legendary level was a divine artifact. A divine artifact could not be carried around by an elven noble, and the restrictions of a divine artifact were great. There was a force field of law energy on it, so it was impossible for him to hold it in his hand casually. Because most of the divine artifacts would be damaged if you held them indiscriminately. It was possible that you would be seriously injured to the point of near death. Even a legendary thief would have to activate omnipotent hands before he dared to touch them. Pay slaughter EXP. Although he did not know what the green leaf in his hand was, Soren did not hesitate to choose to spend soul energy. He felt that the leaf in front of him was definitely not simple. An emerald green light appeared. As if a strong burst of vitality, the wound on Soren's palm healed at an amazing speed. In the blink of an eye, the bloody hole in his palm completely disappeared, and the wound left by the arrow had been completely healed. Then a row of data appeared. Item type, Leaf of Life, unknown. Item grade, Elven Holy Object. Item description, a leaf inherited from the mythological era. It came from an unknown ancient existence. It contains a strong vitality, but a part of its power has been used. Requirements, none. Effects, heal heavy wounds, 1 time per day. Bark spell, 3 times per day. Elven plant revival, 0 to 1. Effect, permanently increases physique by 1 point, HP by 10 points and gains the ability of regeneration. Note, this item cannot increase physique to 25 points or more. Elven Holy Object? When Soren saw the first part of the divine artifact, his expression was still calm, but when he saw the final effects he was very surprised. Because he had a very rare item in his hand that could permanently increase attributes. There were too few items in this world that could increase one's attributes, and even fewer items that could continue to increase one's extraordinary attributes. Although there were some extremely rare items that could increase one's attributes to around 20 points, the number of items that could increase one's extraordinary attributes beyond 20 points could be counted on one's fingers. A faint light of magic appeared. Soren's expression suddenly changed. After putting away the Leaf of Life, he quickly ran forward. Someone had used a spell to locate this item. But all items above the legendary level would have some special energy. Their past owners could use spells to locate the target. Among them, artifacts and high-grade legendary items had special marks on them. Artifacts were the easiest to locate with spells, and sometimes even the gods were interested in them. Soren hesitated for a moment. Then he took out the leaf of life again, stuffed it into his mouth without saying a word, and swallowed it directly. I don't believe you can use spells to locate me after eating it. At the foot of the mountain, Droll looked at the elven nobleman in front of him with a gloomy face. The hunters had retreated. They were not sure if they could kill a powerful knight in silver and a high-grade Droll. Slap. The light of the magic in Droll's hand dissipated. With a cold expression, he slapped the elven nobleman in the face and said in a deep voice, "The leaf of life has been used. You dare to sneak it out? Come back with me to see His Excellency Droll." The tall figure of the knight in silver walked to a pool of blood. She picked up the blood-stained soil and smelled it. Then she turned around and said, "Do you want me to track that guy?" Droll bowed slightly to show his respect and said slowly, "If you can, please bring him back. The energy of the leaf of life is still in his body." Chapter 130. A strong burst of vitality. Soren's mouth was slightly bitter as if he had just chewed a leaf. But he did eat a leaf and it was accompanied by a very strong vitality. It was difficult to describe the feeling in words, but the effect was very powerful. His constitution was increased to 21 points, and he permanently gained an additional 10 points of HP. Now his HP was 146 points, and his vitality was not much different from a level 12 purebred warrior. After all, a warrior's basic HP was 10 points, and a rogue only had 6 points. A row of data appeared in front of him. Use. Leaf of Life. You have permanently increased your constitution by 1 point. You have permanently increased your HP by 10 points. Regeneration, beginner, has been upgraded to intermediate. Even the regeneration ability has been upgraded? Soren looked at his ability data in surprise. He found that the regeneration ability, which originally required 25 constitution to upgrade, had been upgraded once. Regeneration, intermediate, gifted ability. Your strong constitution has exceeded the scope of mortals. Many injuries are no longer fatal to you. Your strong vitality has allowed you to regenerate like a troll. You can gradually recover from any serious injury and below over time. Some of the limb injuries can also be self-recovered. Although you can't regrow an arm or a head like a troll, as your constitution gradually increases, you will be able to do this one day. Regeneration speed per hour plus 2, powerful regeneration ability. Soren looked at his ability data, and his expression was a little excited. He murmured, "According to the current regeneration effect, I can regenerate 48 HP in 24 hours, which is close to 1/3 of my HP. That is to say, I can recover from a serious injury to a light injury in a day. If it wasn't for the near-death state of a limb injury, I could also recover in 3 days." Regeneration was the most powerful survival ability. Soren had dealt with an enemy with advanced regeneration in the past. This guy just needed to find a place to hide for a day, and when he reappeared the next day he was fully recovered. If he couldn't kill him in one breath, there was no way to deal with him. Even a heavily wounded healer could only recover around 50 HP. It took time for priests to memorize divine spells, and the number of divine spells they could memorize in a day was actually not that many. If you were to face enemies with strong regenerative abilities, especially creatures like vampires, you would find that they were like priests. The most perverted ones were vampires who were born with a higher grade. They had the advanced regeneration ability and could even restore their HP by sucking blood. A challenge rating of 15 was no joke. The dark creatures of this world were hard to deal with, and supernatural abilities were nothing out of the ordinary for them. Soren continued heading north. Although he had eaten the leaf of life, he couldn't rule out the possibility that the other party would continue to track him down. This kind of extremely rare item had not been used by anyone until now. It either had a very special religious significance or it might have other special uses. It could increase one's constitution by 1 point, increase one's HP by 10, and obtain an additional regeneration ability. It was very tempting even for legendary professions. That elven nobleman definitely had royal blood in him. If Soren ate this thing, it would be a small matter if he was hung up and beaten. A day passed quickly. Soren didn't know how far he had walked. Anyway, he ran at high speed all the way and tried to sneak in places with shadows. This was a very good ability for rogues. Invisibility had a duration, but a rogue's stealth ability was always effective. If they were bored, they could stay in stealth for a whole day. In the beginning, there were people who transformed themselves into shadow beings, and their stealth ability could be said to have been further improved. If they entered the higher realm of legends, which was roughly around rogue profession level 25, they could also become permanently invisible through special rituals. Although this ability was powerful, it was very difficult to communicate. Soren conservatively estimated that he had walked more than 200 kilometers in a day. Along the way he encountered many villages and a large elven town. There were not many cities on the elven side. There were only 5 or 6 in total, distributed in some very important places. This was a bit like the city-state system. Many places relied on cities for survival. Under normal circumstances, there would not be other large cities within 100 kilometers of a city. The area of the southern region was about 1/3 of Asia's, but there were less than 200 or 300 cities. And they were mainly concentrated in the plains near the river. If it was close to the desert and the virgin forest, the distribution of cities would be even more sparse. There were only 6 large cities in the entire desert area, all of which were built in the oasis area on the edge. The development of cities in this era required a lot of conditions. Amber City rose because of the diversion of the river. If there were no innate geographical conditions, it would be quite difficult to transform and develop the city by relying only on manpower. The sky gradually darkened. Soren saw some eagles on the road, and he couldn't be sure if they were the animal companions that Droll recruited from time to time. However, he was careful to avoid these creatures. When they appeared in the sky, they slowed down along the shadows. Soren didn't make a fire to cook. He just chewed dry food for a meal and then continued on his way. With his extraordinary constitution of 21, this kind of hurrying was not a big consumption. The enhanced dark vision from the Shadow Dancer made him more comfortable at night. If the knight in silver was really tracking him, then the best way to get away from her was at night. After all, their speed was about the same during the day, and it was certainly impossible for the knight in silver to continue tracking at night. Night was the time when wild beasts were active. Soren heard the movements of many wild beasts and saw some green eyes. He was almost at the border of the elves and he didn't go deep into the jungle. He had been moving on the edge of the area. The possibility of encountering Droll inside the forest was very high. Many Droll liked to live in seclusion in the virgin forest. Whoa! A wolf howl sounded. Soren looked at the hills in the distance. The trees nearby were much fewer. Some of the howls were louder and louder. It was the sound of a warg. He was close to the border of the orcs. Although the orcs were good at domesticating wargs and had trained elite wolf riders, there were only 1,000 or 2,000 of them in the entire tribe. This wolf rider needed hundreds of thousands of people to feed, and much of the meat came from corpses and executed criminals in the war. The orcs had reduced the number of domesticated wargs several times during this period because of the huge consumption of meat. It was estimated that this winter would continue to decrease. It was a little better to domesticate wargs. The drow's petrified lizards were the real money burners. He often saw people throwing corpses to feed them in the Underdark. After passing through this barren hilly area, he gradually approached the northern area. The barbarian fortress was on a mountain over there. It had the oldest and purest barbarian training heritage. Every year, advanced barbarians would visit. Soren had tried the training method there. Carrying boulders along the mountain path in the cold wind was definitely a torturous way of training. 3 days. Soren crossed a distance of more than 800 kilometers and approached the range of the Frost Kingdom little by little. The temperature was getting lower and lower. The ground had begun to freeze. There was a heavy frost in the morning, and the top half of the mountain in the distance was covered with ice and snow. The wild beasts here were much thicker in order to adapt to the cold climate. Soren looked travel-worn. Some beard grew on his chin and he looked much more tired than before. But when he saw a peak like the Himalayas in the distance, a smile appeared on his face. He was finally about to reach the icebound valley. Chapter 131. The biting cold wind was like a knife. Soren had to put on a cloak to cover his whole body. This year the north was colder than before. He didn't know if it would only last this winter. Anyway, in his memory the Frost Kingdom was not as cold as it was now. The heavy snow had basically stopped, but the speed of ice and snow melting was very slow. There were almost no traces of melting. Ice had begun to form on all sides, and some rivers were covered with ice that people could pass through. It was now the end of September and there were still 5 or 6 days until October. The beasts in the ice field had begun to come out to look for food. Because of the cold climate, the wolves had also begun to migrate. Soren encountered many monsters along the way, but he avoided them by using stealth. Looking from afar, the mountain was right in front of him, but when he walked he found that it was still not there. Soren walked for half a day before he gradually approached the range of the icebound valley because there were many ice crystals on the trees around. The icebound valley was one of the coldest places. The climate here was somewhat special, and it hadn't changed for hundreds of years. Traces of carriages appeared in the wind and snow. Soren stopped to observe and found that there should be a caravan in front of him. Who would go to the Frost Kingdom in winter? Soren pushed away the snow and looked at the traces of the wheels. The big carriage should have been specially modified to widen the bearing area, but it wasn't modified into a sleigh. It didn't look like people from the south. They should have come from the port cities in the central region. The number of people in the caravan was relatively large. Soren estimated that there were at least 30 or 40 people. There shouldn't be any caravans in this season, right? Soren carefully looked in front of him, but he didn't see them. They probably passed by yesterday. Moving forward in the ice field was slow. Soren estimated that he would meet these people tonight. He just didn't know who would go north in such a cold weather. There were traces of bonfires nearby, and some pieces of food were thrown directly on the side of the road. Soren looked at the debris in front of him and frowned because he felt that it wasn't a caravan in front of him. The ice on the road was getting thicker and thicker. When the sky gradually darkened, Soren finally saw a group of people in front of him. They were 3 large, modified carriages. The pack beast was a type of yak with thick fur. Its entire body was snow-white and there was only one horn on its head. These yaks were squatting in a circle around the perimeter to block the cold wind. In front of them was an experienced team. They had obviously been to the ice plains before and knew how to make themselves more comfortable, just like how people in the desert knew how to use camels to block the wind and sand. The tamed pack beasts were very tame. Soren did not see any caravan guards, nor did he see many mounts. These people in front of him were not merchants. Who? A short figure jumped out and squinted its eyes. Soren saw a green-skinned goblin, but it was different from the other goblins he had seen before. Its facial expression was richer, and its face was smeared with strange paint. It looked like a clown. As the goblin shouted, more than a dozen people near the carriage stood up. Almost all kinds of races could be seen, and there were even beautiful elves standing next to the burly orcs. Circus. Soren frowned slightly, walked over slowly and smiled. A traveler passing by saw you here and came to ask for a hot soup. The green-skinned goblin looked at him up and down, then showed a funny smile and waved. Come here. We just went camping. A lone adventurer. It didn't seem to be much danger, at least not a threat to such a large caravan. Soren slowly approached, but his expression was not completely relaxed. He looked around and asked, Circus? Are you going to the Frost Kingdom to perform? There were 3 big carriages. 2 of them were loaded with a lot of sundries, many of which were tools for the performance. The other one was not very clear, but it looked quite gorgeous from the outside. Of course. A beautiful elf stood up. Her skin was very delicate, and she seemed to have the bloodline of a grassland elf. She was wearing an exquisite dress, which was a bit like the dress of a lady performing a dance. However, the neckline was quite wide, revealing a white and smooth chest. There was a split on the side of the dress and there should be a button inside. If it was unbuttoned, it would reveal her white thighs. She tilted her head and looked at Soren. After thinking that he didn't look like a bad guy, she complained, If it's not for the performance, who would want to come to this cold place? Soren narrowed his eyes slightly, not because of the beauty of the other party, nor because of the white chest, but because of the clothes on her body. In such cold weather she still wore so little. Although it was cold, she still looked normal. She should be an advanced professional. Don't underestimate the performers in this world because many of them were part-time bards, especially such circuses, opera troupes, and performance troupes. The number of professionals in them could reach up to half, and most of them were quite expensive. These professionals were like celebrities in his previous life. They would be welcomed everywhere they went, and a formal performance might earn them more than adventurers risking their lives for them. Just like the Green Goblin just now, it should be a special profession that was advanced from a bard to a clown dancer. That was why it could find Soren so quickly. The distance between them was a little closer. Soren saw an emblem with a slim shadow on it. There were barriers on all sides and colorful gauze. He looked at these people in surprise and wondered, the Phantom Circus? The elf girl looked at him with a smile and said, You've heard of us. I've heard of you. Soren nodded and said slowly, You're very famous in Port Arthur. It is said that there are some very special and wonderful performances. The elf girl giggled and looked at him playfully. Not everyone is qualified to watch those performances. Soren shrugged slightly. He didn't have much expectation for those performances. Come here. The green goblin gestured for him to sit next to the bonfire. It looked completely different from the goblins in the wilderness. It should be the goblins near the sand port. The goblins there used to be servants of the great Arcanus. After the destruction of the Arcane Empire, they still kept part of their heritage. Their skin color was lighter than other goblins, and they didn't have a sense of identity with the goblins in the wilderness. The way they looked at the goblins in the wilderness was like how Africans looked at cannibals. When it was time to kill, they would never show mercy. My name is Coppercoin. I'm a clown. The goblin showed a funny smile and waved the food in its hand. Do you want to try? Barbecue ice frog. Only here can you eat good food. It tastes much better than other bullfrogs. Ice frog? Soren looked at the food in its hand and frowned. This seems to be poisonous, right? It will cause diarrhea after eating it. It's okay. Coppercoin shrugged and said, goblins dare to eat anything. Coppercoin likes to eat frogs. He's not afraid of being poisoned. Next to the bonfire, a group of people were sitting around. There were orcs, dwarves, elves, humans, and so on. There were more than 20 of them, and almost half of them were women. Soren glanced at them and found that most of them were advanced professionals. Among them there was a high proportion of bards. The Phantom Circus was an organization that was active near the port. Of course, the members in front of him weren't the only ones. They should only be a part of it. Except for the two people who were talking, the others were very indifferent to Soren. They were just busy with their own things. There was a human girl wearing a doll mask with dozens of throwing knives on her waist. She looked at him provocatively from time to time. The elf girl should be one of the people in charge, if the woman who didn't show up in the carriage was not. What's your name? Why did you come to this cold place alone? The elf girl came over and sat down directly next to Soren. She had a special fragrance on her body. Soren was familiar with this smell. The priest in charge of the goddess of lust often had this smell. Soren smiled and looked at her. Soren. I'm a lone adventurer who wants to go to the Frost Kingdom. Where is your destination? The elf girl glanced at his curved sword and smiled. To Arendelle. Their Princess Royal is about to ascend the throne. The court steward invited us to perform. Both sides were tentatively communicating. The others didn't seem to care much, but their attention was actually on Soren. After all, he was a stranger. Arendelle? Soren's expression was a little surprised. Then he seemed to remember something and said, that place seems to be a bit special. Didn't you hear anything before you went? The elf girl smiled slyly and said playfully, heard what? We haven't heard anything. Have you heard anything about it? Soren glanced at her, shrugged gently and said, isn't there a legend that the incarnation of the goddess of ice has descended there? The elf girl blinked and smiled. Is that so? Then I haven't seen the incarnation of the goddess. There was a crisp sound of bells in the carriage. The elf girl's expression froze, then she quickly got up and walked over. The curtain was very thick and nothing could be seen outside. After a while, the elf girl came out again and looked at the others. The leader said to let you have a good rest and try to get out of the frozen valley tomorrow morning. By the way, your name is Soren, right? You can also camp here. If you don't have anything, I'll ask them to prepare one for you. Solon smiled and shook his head, indicating that there was no need. As the woman in the carriage spoke, the other's attitude towards him was slightly better. A group of people began to get busy, and Soren also made a simple arrangement. The cold wind outside was still very strong, and the bonfire would dim from time to time. The human girl with a mask was watching over the bonfire. As they passed by the gorgeous carriage, Soren glanced at it. He seemed to notice some special wet marks because a thin layer of ice had formed because of the cold weather. The marks were a bit like those left by snakes. Chapter 132. The night passed quietly. If you met other travelers in the wilderness, you could at least get along if you could communicate with them without any obvious hostility. Just like how Soren was willing to accept Aladdin on the road, the performers of the Phantom Circus also temporarily accepted him for a night after they felt that he wasn't dangerous. In this world, beliefs were more effective than moral constraints. Of course, the one who really spoke was the woman in the carriage who didn't show her face. She was the real core of the circus. As for why Soren was sure that it was a woman, it was mainly because of the decoration of the carriage, the faint fragrance, and a legend that he had heard before. It was said that there was a sea witch in the Phantom Circus, but no one knew what this sea witch was. Some guessed that she was a sea demon while others guessed that she was an undersea witch. Anyway, there were a lot of random guesses and very few people knew the real answer. The Phantom Circus's performance fee was very high. The people in front of him had to spend at least 5,000 to 6,000 Kindler coins. Among most circuses, singing and dancing troupes and performing troupes, the Phantom Circus had a relatively good reputation. Basically, it was rare to hear of any illegal activities. Soren didn't know much about them. In the past, he paid the most attention to the most famous Dark Moon Circus. In this world, there was a powerful deity called the Lady of Silver Moon. The knight in silver that Soren met was her believer. The Dark Moon Circus was also an organization that served her, but the latter was a hidden assassin organization. They would assassinate targets that they thought were evil. They represented the dark side of the moon. They were an organization that believed in a kind deity, but their methods were cruel and merciless. Soren had fought with them before he became a legend. He lost 2 fingers to a terrifying clown dancer. Until now, he still didn't believe that those people who killed without batting an eyelid really believed in the Lady of Silvermoon. In the circus, there were often special professions that advanced. The green-skinned goblin called Copper Coin wasn't difficult for Soren to recognize his profession, but it wasn't so easy to judge the others. The only thing that could be confirmed was that many of them were part-time bards. Their acting skills were not low and their acting skills were also quite good. When interacting with them, it was difficult to determine whether they were telling the truth or just acting in front of you. For example, that beautiful elf girl. Performance, deception, and intimidation were the 3 basic skills of the circus. Soren had trained his deception ability in the past. The drow who trained Soren had also given him a saying, "Life is like a play, it all depends on your acting skills." Even if he had 200 to 300 points in his acting skill, that was still a real power. To be honest, when Soren saw this group of people, he really missed the observation ability that he had learned in the past. The circus had people taking turns to keep watch. In the entire group, only the green-skinned goblin didn't sleep. It didn't stand guard outside the circle. It just squatted by the bonfire and roasted frogs. It didn't know how much it ate that night. Anyway, it didn't seem to be full. There was a small pile of bones the next day. It was the real core of the group. It was able to detect Soren from a distance. This clown dancer that evolved from a goblin wasn't simple. Soren didn't have much confidence in defeating it. Even a mediocre race would give birth to some outstanding talents. Soren wouldn't underestimate anyone. Under the morning sun, the circus people began to prepare breakfast. They directly melted ice and snow in a pot. The elf girl even carried a basin of hot water into the carriage. This should have been a very normal action. However, Soren still carefully looked at it. He didn't expect to find something unexpected. The water was hot when it was brought in. It was so hot that it emitted white steam. However, when the elf girl carried it out, the water in the basin was cold. He could vaguely see a strand of floating ice. In less than 5 minutes, the basin of hot water turned into ice water. Interesting. Soren's expression didn't change. He pulled out his curved sword to shave his beard. He had been rushing through the night, so his beard had grown a little. Copper came over with a bowl of hot soup. He glanced at Soren's blade. The tiny fish scales reflected the light and looked very exquisite. Good sword. He praised and handed the hot soup to Soren. The circus soon began to move. The people in the big carriage still didn't show up. The others were busy with their own things. They seemed very well trained. The burly orc carried a whip to drive the pack beast and put the other 2 carriages on it. He should be the circus's beast tamer. However, there were no other beasts. Perhaps it was because the weather was too cold to bring them here. A good beast tamer could tame a beast in 1 or 2 days. It was guaranteed that they would be more obedient than Drill's animal companions. The group soon began to move forward. Soren slowed down a little and prepared to follow them through the frozen valley. That place was a little strange. It would be safer with more people. It was quiet along the way. No one would be in a good mood to travel in this world of ice and snow. The elven girl was still wearing a slightly revealing dress. Her tall figure kept moving back and forth. From time to time she would shout and command them to move forward. Looking at her footsteps on the snow, Soren estimated that her agility was more than 20 points. Because there were only shallow footprints on the ground, he didn't know what kind of special class she had advanced. From the rhythm and movements of her body, Soren judged that her reflexes and dodges were very strong. Her advanced class might be similar to the shadow dancer, but she should be a bard. The ice on the ground was getting thicker and thicker. The others gradually became nervous. After a valley appeared in front of them, they took a little rest and began to speed up. The goblin clown walked at the front of the group. He looked up at the cliffs on both sides and the top of the mountain. He said in a deep voice, "There is a possibility of encountering ice trolls here. Everyone hurry up and pass through. Don't shout. If you are unlucky, you will be unlucky if you encounter an avalanche." There were cliffs on all sides and the cliffs were covered with ice. The elven girl stood on the carriage and looked up at the sky. Of course, it could also be the steep top of the mountain. She seemed to have found something. It should be the ice trolls. There were many ice trolls living on the top of the mountain. If it weren't for the scarcity of food, these ice trolls would not attack travelers below the valley. Soren. The elven girl landed lightly beside him, looked at him and blinked. "It seems that you are also a knowledgeable adventurer. Since you know the legend of Arendelle, do you know why this place is called Icebound Valley? Is this a test? Or does she want to know something from me?" Soren frowned slightly, looked at her and said, "The real Icebound Valley is ahead, but it used to be called Icewind Valley a long time ago. It is said that the valley was completely frozen because of a legendary battle. The ice there is very thick. The ice will not melt all year round. The people of the Frost Kingdom don't dare to go out there. They usually trade by sea after spring. Droll once tried to remove the anomaly in front, but it seems to have failed. There is a special energy in Icebound Valley. You should be careful later. Elementals may appear in Icebound Valley in winter. Generally, no one goes there in winter." "That's right. The real ice in Icebound Valley is half a meter below, and its hardness is similar to diamond. If you are interested, you can try your weapon. It is said that there is some treasure below, but no one can cut through the ice." Hearing Soren's words, the others could not help but be surprised. As they continued to move forward, the thickness of the ice became higher and higher. Almost everything in front of them was covered with a layer of ice, and the road was slightly slippery. The elven girl seemed to be very interested in what he said. She whispered a few words beside the goblin clown, and it quickly broke the ice with a dagger. Soon it dug about 50 centimeters deep, and then saw a layer of light blue ice. Clang! Its dagger pierced the ice with a crisp sound. The goblin clown moved its palm and seemed to be a little numb. Then it said, "It's really as hard as diamond. How come I've never heard of it before?" There was only a shallow mark on the light blue ice. Soren shrugged and said, "I actually heard about it, but it seems that the legend is true. Icebound Valley." The thickness of the ice on the surface was not high, about the same as other ice cubes. Below was a special layer of ice that was as hard as diamond. Rare-grade weapons could only leave a shallow mark on it. At the beginning, many people wanted to find the secret below, but no one succeeded. It was said that something was frozen below, and it might be a divine artifact. Anyway, it had been frozen for a long time. It was not until the end of the frost riot that the ice here suddenly melted. The elven girl was obviously very interested. She reached out her finger and stroked the light blue ice, then walked into the carriage and said something. Then the team continued to move forward. The others also tried it curiously and found that the hardness of the ice was really beyond imagination. This was something left behind by supernatural abilities. There seemed to be whispers in the cold wind. It might be an illusion or it might be real. Anyway, this sound had been there for hundreds of years. The people of the Frost Kingdom thought that there was a mysterious witch living here. In the past, all the locations had been explored, and there were basically no traces of human life. So the final conclusion was that this whisper-like sound mixed in the cold wind was not the work of supernatural abilities, but the sound was caused by a special environment. In Icebound Valley, as long as the wind was strong, there would be this kind of whisper-like sound. Fortunately, the journey here was not long. If they sped up, they could walk there in half a morning. They did not encounter any monsters along the way. Soren noticed that only one of the 3 carriages had a thin layer of ice, which was the carriage where the leader of the Phantom Circus stayed. From here they parted ways. Soren headed towards the glacial mountains near the north, while they followed the road to the sea. Arendelle was a kingdom of ice and snow near the sea. The Princess Royal, who was about to ascend the throne, seemed to be a legendary destiny sorcerer. If he didn't remember wrongly. After the mysterious disappearance of the Frost Goddess, her magic was out of control for a while, and the nearby sea was completely frozen. In the end, the Frost Riot broke out, and the Princess Royal fought against the lesser divine power, Winter Maiden. It seemed that the lesser divine of the evil alignment, the Maiden of Pain, also joined in the fun this time. Chapter 133. Soren moved forward in the cold wind. Although he was sure that the Phantom Circus he encountered had some secrets, He had little interest in getting involved. Most of the time, trouble came to him, so he had to learn to restrain his excessive curiosity. The rest of the people in the Phantom Circus were easier to deal with. The only thing that Soren couldn't see through was the elven girl and the woman in the carriage who never showed up. The thin ice on the edge of the carriage left a deep impression on Soren. The person inside seemed to have uncontrollable power. Among all the spellcasting professions, wizards were the ones who had the best control over the power of magic. Then there was the priest and the droll. Although their power came from the gods and faith, they could control it with ease. The most uncontrollable power was the talent of the warlock. This was also the reason why Gloria was worried that Vivian would cause great damage. They were going to the kingdom of Arendelle, where the Princess Royal was about to ascend the throne, was also a dangerous warlock. The more powerful and talented the warlock was, the more dangerous it would be. It would take a long time for them to learn to control their power. The person inside was definitely not a wizard. Then the possibility that she was a warlock was more than 50%, and a powerful warlock who couldn't fully control her power. In contrast, Vivian was much better at controlling her power. She almost didn't have the period of energy rampage that other warlocks had to go through. The warlock's introverted personality was caused by the early energy rampage. Sometimes they even hurt people close to them because of the uncontrollable power. Snowflakes fell from the sky. The snow wasn't very heavy, but Soren's body was still covered with a layer of snow. He shook his cloak and the snow fell to the ground. It was almost afternoon and he passed through a dense forest covered with snow. The road ahead gradually became more spacious, which meant that he was close to the area of human activity. There weren't many goblins and kobolds in the Frost Kingdom. The climate was too cold, but there were bugbears, a creature more dangerous than gnolls. Those creatures were called goblins, but their size and appearance were very different. Maybe they really had a partial bloodline. It was very easy for subspecies to mutate. Soren walked for about 10 kilometers before he vaguely heard the sound of music. It seemed to be a sorrowful tune. He frowned and listened to it for a while before heading in the direction of the music. Camping in the wild in the Frost Kingdom was very uncomfortable because the climate was too cold. Sometimes one's body would freeze after sleeping. The temperature here was below 0 degrees all year round. Soren decided to find a human town to rest and recover, and at the same time, replenish the number of spells he had mastered. A group of people appeared in front of him. Most of them wore fur coats, which were the most important property of the Frost Kingdom's human families. Their hair was more exuberant, and their faces were a bit like Nordic people. They were not as diverse as the southern region. In this world, people with black eyes and black hair were very common. There were also elves. Some of the incarnations of the gods looked like this, but the people in the northern part of the continental shelf tended to have European characteristics. If it was near the desert, the characteristics of the people were more obvious. Experienced people could rely on this to judge where the other party came from. Soren had obvious southern characteristics. His hair was black and flaxen, and his pupils were close to black-brown. Part of it was the human bloodline, and the other part was the characteristics of the elven bloodline. So when the group saw Soren, they recognized that he was not a native of the Frost Kingdom, but an adventurer from outside. An old northerner came out. He looked at Soren and said slowly, "Outsider, where are you going? Recently, outsiders are not very welcome here." Soren leaned over slightly and glanced at the bodies in the crowd. They were holding a funeral and replied, "I'm a traveling adventurer. I want to stay in a nearby town for a while." He glanced at the center. There were 3 bodies on the ground, all of which were adult men. He could not help but frown slightly and said slowly, "May their souls rest in peace. I would like to ask what exactly happened. Why do you not welcome outsiders?" Something must have happened. 3 adult men would not die suddenly. Looking at the scale of their funeral, the dead people had some status. The old man hesitated for a moment, then looked at the others and said slowly, "Recently, a group of evil fallen people have entered the Frost Kingdom. There is a terrible witch among them. She used magic to confuse many people. Many people have been killed. Our town is also threatened. The sheriff has closed the town and now outsiders are not allowed to come close. Maybe you can try somewhere else." Soren frowned and took a step forward. A strong man stepped forward and put his hand on his weapon. The old man waved his hand to stop them. His rich experience told him that solo adventurers were not easy to deal with, so there was no need to provoke them directly. That was why he politely refused. Otherwise, he could have just asked someone to expel him. There had been a series of deaths in the town, and outsiders had been rejected. Soren seemed to see something. He turned his head and said, "Can I see these bodies? Perhaps I can be of help." The old man hesitated for a moment, then nodded gently. Some of the others obviously wanted to say something. They did not seem to agree with such a desecration of the dead. The funeral had already begun, but they were stopped by the old man. "Excuse me." Soren pushed through the crowd in front of him and saw a woman with red eyes. She was holding 2 children and standing next to her. She had lost the pillar of her family, so her future would be very difficult. If she did not have a rich family property, then she could only remarry. Otherwise it would be difficult for a woman to raise 2 children. Soren noticed that there was a scar on the neck of the corpse. He opened the eyes of the deceased and pressed his finger on the forehead of the corpse. The 3 corpses were a little similar. They were all adult and strong men. Their expressions were a little strange and twisted. It seemed that they were in great pain before they died, but there was a strange smile in the pain. There was a kindler on their lips. This was a tradition close to the north. In their legends there was a god of death who liked wealth very much. The coins on their lips were a tribute to them. The rich put a kindler, the commoners put a silver dural, and the poor put a copper dural. The tradition in the north believed that the souls of the dead were first collected by the god of death, and then it was up to them to decide whether these souls would return to the kingdom of the gods or enter the river Styx. The first recipient of the souls must be the god of death. They were born with great power. The god of death was one of the few divine systems that had a greater divine power. The ancient god of death, the king of the dead, the king of the end of all things, and the recorder of death, still existed in a corner of the river Styx. He used to be the master of the underworld, although now he had retired. This powerful ancient god of death was the only ancient god who had a greater divine power in the past and had not fallen. He had existed for a long time, and it was said that he had been waiting for the end of all things. He waited for the end of the universe, recorded the final death and completed his final mission. Regarding the greater divine power of the master level, he was also the only standard that could be clearly measured. This was because he personally separated his power and gave the divine title of death to 3 gods. This ancient god of death, who was regarded as the standard of a greater divine power, divided his divine power to create 3 greater divine power gods of death, and also separated the divine title of the god of death that covered the multiverse. How strong was this ancient god of death? The information collected by Soren was not very clear. The only thing he could know was that there was a period of turmoil in the past, but it only affected the heavens and did not affect the abyss and hell. The scope of the turmoil was also very small. It was only concentrated in the material plane, and it did not affect the elemental gods and some of the ancient gods. It was a period of small-scale turmoil. During this period, the 3 gods of death joined forces to fight against nearly half of the gods in the upper plane. Although they failed in the end, the consequences had been affecting them until now. The template of the son of slaughter was said to be the descendant of the god of slaughter, one of the 3 gods of death. And it was not the direct bloodline. A lot of information had been lost, especially after the rise of the Arcane Empire. There was a very long gap in time, and there was a blank period of more than 3,000 years in the literature record. Soren remembered that there was a period of conspiracy theories that were very popular. This was because the destruction of the Arcane Empire and the disappearance of the greater divine power at the same time. After the destruction of the Arcane Empire, there was no greater divine power. Some people speculated that in this struggle, one of the greater divine powers lost, and so did the Arcane Empire. Only the gods in the heavens still existed. Otherwise, there was no way to explain why the Arcane Empire would study the elemental annihilation matter and such a terrible existence as the neutron star golem. Moreover, the last small-scale turmoil was because the greater divine power gods forcibly took away the divine titles of the other gods in the heavens. Conspiracy theorists thought that this was enough to make the other gods have the idea of rebelling and even killing the greater divine power gods. They also listed some of the information that the Arcane Empire had the ability to help kill the greater divine power, because someone had been to the Nirvana mechanical mirror, challenge rating 25. The conspiracy theorists also tried to speculate the truth of this turbulent period. Unfortunately, there was no useful information because this time, not only the gods in the heavens, but also the ancient gods in the abyss, hell, and the elemental plane had all lost the power of divinity. This time, it was obviously not something that a greater divine power could do because this time, none of the gods were spared. It was said that the ancient god of death, who had given up most of his divine power, was beaten down. Soren lifted the clothes on the body, and this action made the others angry. Some even wanted to attack him because he directly took off the clothes of the dead body. Clang. Soren pulled out his curved sword and pointed it at the people who wanted to attack, and they could not help but take a step back. He frowned and looked at the wounds on the body, which were covered with hideous and shocking wounds. Soren's face was gloomy. He used his fingers to separate the broken flesh and murmured, "Snake whip?" Chapter 134. Snakehead Whip. The most vicious special weapon in the Underdark could only be used by those who had trained in special abilities. Most of them were priests of the Queen of Spiders. They used this weapon to torture the enemy and make the enemy feel extreme physical pain. The only other person who could use this weapon was the Maiden of Pain, who was in charge of torture, pain, torture, and so on. In the past 100 or 200 years, she had been involved in the pleasure of abuse and wanted to use it to extend the divine domain of pleasure, lust, taboo, and so on. If she succeeded, she could deprive the divine domain of sex and abuse and lust and supplement it with the divine domain of pain and torture. Eventually, it would become a springboard for seizing the divine domains of lust, pleasure, reproduction, sex, and so on. She didn't necessarily need to be the main god of the whole world. Even if it was just the sex and abuse god that the Drows believed in, she could use it to touch the divine domain of lust. It was impossible for the gods to expand their divine domain for no reason. The power of these divine domains extended mutually. For example, the core divine domain of the Queen of Spiders was the god of the Drows. All the domains related to the Drows were included in this divine domain. Below this divine domain, there were other extended divine domains of the Queen of Spiders, such as spiders, evil, darkness, murder, and so on. Many gods would extend their domain of divinity to completely absorb the power of their opponents before killing them. The Frost Kingdom is not safe anymore. This was the first thought in Soren's mind. His original plan was to bring Vivian here to avoid the coming time of troubles. But now everything in front of him told him that although the time of troubles did not affect this place on a large scale, the chaos of ice and snow had begun to ferment. Everything in front of him was definitely related to the Maiden of Pain, but it was not until 2 or 3 years later that it completely broke out. Before that, it was clear that her believers had been active in the Frost Kingdom. No place was safe. Soren felt that the corpse in front of him seemed to be mocking him, mocking his timidity and escape. He tried his best to bring Vivian here to avoid the time of troubles. But now it was like being slapped in the face, telling him in a cold and ruthless tone that there was no real safe place in this era. Even the Frost Kingdom, which he thought had not been affected by the time of troubles, began to brew the coming storm of slaughter. Ah! Soren's expression was a little ferocious, revealing a psychotic smile. He slowly withdrew his scimitar, looked up at the sky, and murmured, "God, are you forcing me to do this?" There was nowhere to run. If the believers of the Maiden of Pain really came here, then the Frost Kingdom would not be as safe as imagined. It took Soren almost a month to travel from Amber City to Whiterun. He cleared out all the monsters in his way, crossed the plains, and arrived at Autumnfall. From there he entered the Elven Kingdom, crossed the Forest of Dreams, and fought against the Hunters. After that, he crossed the barren plains and entered the frigid north. How much blood had he lost along the way? How many times had he fought? However, everything in front of him was like a loud slap to his face, telling him that his actions over the past month were laughable. He ran away like a clown, but in the end he couldn't escape anything. Soren's back was covered with scars, left by the gnolls and the ogres. He only wanted to take Vivian away from danger and find a relatively safe place to avoid the time of troubles. However, the scene in front of him seemed to have whipped his heart with a snakehead whip. While the pain penetrated his bone marrow, it also suddenly woke him up. He couldn't escape no matter where he went. Even the most peaceful Frost Kingdom had begun to brew a storm. There was no real safe place in the world. There was only battle. There was only battle left. Soren's palm clenched the scimitar, and his fingers turned white because of excessive force. He glanced coldly at the others around him. His cold gaze was like a blade, making the others retreat far away at once. It was a kind of killing intent that made them feel cold all over when they were stared at by Soren. Since they couldn't escape, then let's fight. For Vivian and for himself, he had to fight his way out of this world. He had already fled for thousands of kilometers, almost across half of the continent, but the bloody reality woke him up. There were some things that he had to face no matter how hard he tried. As long as he was still alive in this world, he couldn't escape. Stop. A steady female voice suddenly sounded, and then a middle-aged woman with an amiable face walked over accompanied by two young girls. She frowned and glanced at Soren, then glanced at the others and slowly said, "What are you doing? All of you put away your weapons." This middle-aged woman seemed to have a very high status. After seeing her, the others couldn't help but bow slightly. Those who pulled out their weapons because of Soren's actions also hesitated for a moment and put them away. This was the town's priest, and a priest of the goddess of agriculture. Any gods that were closely related to their lives would be respected by the people. The priest of the goddess of agriculture had a very high status in society. This was because anything related to food would be taken more seriously. Soren's emotional fluctuations only lasted for a moment, then he bowed slightly to apologize and said slowly, "I'm sorry. I was a little emotional." The middle-aged woman looked at him deeply. Her face was quite graceful and amiable, full of a maternal aura. This was the power of the god she served. The goddess of agriculture was the daughter of Mother Gaia. After Mother Gaia retired, the goddess of agriculture took over the divine position of Mother Gaia. She was also the only god who didn't have a divine position of battle but had the peak of great divine power. The goddess of agriculture's divine power level was similar to that of the elven main god. Under her were the river goddess, the mountain goddess, the lake goddess, and other gods. It was a special divine system independent of nature, and it was the connection point between the natural divine system and the human divine system. This was because the goddess of agriculture's father was the god of light. The god of light was the previous light of dawn, the god that the young priest in Amber City worshipped. He was the partner of Mother Gaia and had a very close relationship with her. Although Mother Gaia had many interactions with gods in her long life, the light of dawn was her most important partner. Everything grew because of the sun, and Mother Gaia gave birth to the goddess of agriculture. She gave the divine position of agriculture to her daughter and helped her become a new god. The god of light was her most reliable ally, and the power of light protected the field of agriculture. In just a few thousand years, the goddess of agriculture did not kill any gods, nor did she start any wars. She relied on the expansion of faith all the way from a weak divine power to a great divine power, and became one of the most powerful gods in the whole world. The believers of the goddess of agriculture were all over the farming races, and her temples could be seen almost everywhere. Even some evil species would hold a sacrificial ceremony at a fixed time every year. The divine position of agriculture produced too many fields, and the power it possessed was very strong. It was almost the foundation of the whole world's development. Therefore, the priests of the goddess of agriculture were respected in human society, especially among the lower-class civilians. This was because agriculture was what they relied on to survive, and whether they lived well depended on the harvest in the fields. "Relax, child." The middle-aged woman reached out and touched Soren's forehead. Although he was a little resistant, he did not avoid it. A gentle force flowed into his body and gradually calmed his emotions. This was the mother power of the earth, and the goddess of agriculture inherited part of the mother power of the earth. This force calmed Soren down a little, and his hand that was holding the curved sword gently loosened. The goddess of agriculture advocated better development of agriculture, and more food harvest to reduce conflicts and wars between races. This was a neutral and kind god, and he was also the god who had the least desire to fight. Evil species rarely sacrificed to good gods, but the goddess of agriculture was an exception. She still had some believers in the evil camp. It seemed that she also tolerated these believers. She was different from the god of light, who could not tolerate sand in his eyes. The goddess of agriculture strictly adhered to the rules of neutrality and kindness, but she tried her best to tolerate everything. "Very good." The middle-aged woman smiled and said slowly, "Can you tell me what you know? This group of evil guys has caused a lot of panic recently, and we all hope to find them." Soren let out a long breath, then bowed slightly and said, "It seems that they are the believers and followers of the Maiden of Pain. The weapon that killed them was a snake-headed whip. This weapon is very rare on the ground. In the Underdark, only the priests of the Queen of Spiders and the followers of the Maiden of Pain can use it." "The Maiden of Pain?" The middle-aged woman frowned. Although the god in charge of torture, pain, and whipping was not powerful, she was not easy to deal with at all. For a long time, some gods could not avoid falling, but this god, who was only a low-level god, lived longer than many mid-level evil gods. This was not just because of power. The clergy of pain and torture belonged to the field of battle. Although there were not many believers of the Maiden of Pain, their combat power was not low, and many of them were cruel and experienced in killing. The middle-aged woman glanced at Soren and smiled. "Child, you look tired. Maybe you would like to go to the town to rest." She stretched out her palm and made an inviting gesture. Chapter 135. After listening to Soren's words, a middle-aged man next to him frowned and looked at the body. There were very few drows in the Frost Kingdom, and there was no passage connecting to the Underdark. If he hadn't been in the Underdark for a long time, he wouldn't have recognized the snakehead whip because the priest of the Queen of Spiders rarely fought. In Soren's memory, in addition to the believers of the Maiden of Pain, only the succubi in the abyss could give people a strange sense of pleasure when they were in pain. The Maiden of Pain was one of the gods who was best at using whip weapons, only slightly worse than the Queen of Succubus. The Queen of Spiders used the snakehead whip to torture the enemy. The others were still holding funerals. The middle-aged woman invited Soren to the location of the Temple of Agriculture. There was a small town in front of them, but it was closed on all sides and there were many guards nearby. A burly man who looked like a sheriff came over, glanced at Soren in front of him, and then bowed slightly to the priest of the goddess of agriculture and said, "Priest Tina." "Who is he?" The middle-aged woman glanced at him and said slowly, "A traveling adventurer. Maybe he can help us." The evil degenerates have become more and more rampant recently. Now the number of people killed has reached more than a dozen. The residents of the town are a little panicked. "We must stop this madness." The sheriff obviously wanted to say something but he swallowed it back. Since this happened more than half a month ago, the security team had not had the slightest clue, and the number of people killed increased again and again. At first it was only one person. They could quietly cover it up and blame it on the ferocious bandits. But later the number of people killed became 2, and recently 3 people were killed at the same time. Now, even an idiot knew that this was definitely not a simple murder case. Looking at their injuries, they didn't look like crazy murderers, but more like victims of some evil ritual. Soren's eyes swept over him, and then stopped on a young man not far behind him. The other party noticed his gaze and avoided it. Although he didn't know why, he looked a little guilty. It was a skinny young man with brown hair and brown eyes. His legs seemed to be somewhat inconvenient, as if he was disabled. Soren stopped, looked at the young man and asked, "Who is he?" Hearing Soren's question, the young man subconsciously took half a step back. His eyes were slightly flustered. The middle-aged woman seemed to have noticed something. She frowned and said, "He is a blacksmith's apprentice. One of the victims outside is a blacksmith." Soren suddenly reached out and grabbed the young man's arm. With a twist of his hand, he pinned the young man to the ground. This sudden turn of events caught everyone off guard. Before they could ask, Soren said in a deep voice, "Get someone to take off his clothes." Everyone was stunned for a moment, but then the middle-aged woman gave the order with a serious expression. "What are you doing? He was just an outsider. You actually allowed him to attack me." The young man was obviously flustered. He struggled desperately and shouted at the same time, "I didn't kill anyone. Everyone knows that my legs are inconvenient. How could I kill Master Kent? Not to mention killing the others. I'm not the murderer." The sheriff frowned and said in a deep voice, "Let him go. Koro is just a poor child. He never received any combat training. He can't even beat a wolf. There were trained guards among the victims. He can't be the murderer." Soren looked at him indifferently. He directly took off the young man's arm and said slowly, "I didn't say he was the murderer. Take off his clothes." The 2 guards looked at each other and took off the young man's clothes. Immediately the scars on his back were exposed. The others couldn't help but feel sorry for him because there were many scars on the young man's body. It seemed that he was beaten a lot in the past. The status of an apprentice in this era was very low. Soren looked at the scars on his shoulder. They seemed to be left behind by someone in the past. The sheriff said that he was a poor child. It was probably because he knew what happened to him in the past. But that wasn't what Soren was looking for. He directly tore off the young man's clothes and saw a hideous scar. The other scars were left a long time ago, but this scar was very fresh. It should have been left in the past month. Soren directly pressed the young man down, stepped on his neck with his foot and said in a deep voice, "Has he been whipped recently?" Whipping. It was a very common punishment used to punish people who committed crimes. No. It was the middle-aged woman who answered Soren. She looked at the wound and frowned. No one has been whipped recently. Our laws here rarely use whipping. Soren retracted his foot, looked down at the silent young man on the ground and said slowly, "Don't tell me you whipped yourself for no reason and with a barbed whip." He's a follower of the Maiden of Pain. It should be a ceremony that was held in the past month. The Maiden of Pain's followers have a whipping ceremony. They let people whip themselves with a barbed metal whip so that they can feel the power of pain and torture. I don't think I need to teach you what to do next, right? Find a way to pry open his mouth and make him tell you who the other followers are? The Maiden of Pain should have developed her religion here. Soren's expression was cold and he didn't care about the sheriff's pale face. He had found a clue as soon as he arrived, but they had been busy for half a month without any results. This was a slap in the face. Take him away. The middle-aged woman's face was very ugly. When it came to matters of faith, the priests would also become very cruel. She said in a deep voice, "Torture him. Make him tell us who else has fallen to the evil side." The young man was lifted up by 2 guards. He stared at Soren and the others nearby with vicious eyes. Finally, he looked at the middle-aged woman with a ferocious expression and said, "You will all die. After the goddess of pain comes, she will torture you severely. In the end, she will kill you all. You bunch of hypocrites. What a hypocritical demon. You hypocritical bitch. You watched my mother die of illness, but you didn't want to save her. You watched me being beaten by the blacksmith, but you didn't do anything. You hypocrites. I curse you all. I curse you all to hell." He had fallen to become a follower of the goddess of pain. This young man must have experienced something bad. Unfortunately, Soren had no interest in knowing. He also didn't have such strong sympathy. He just said in a deep voice, "The followers of the goddess of pain have a high tolerance for pain. I think you'd better use some clever means when you torture him." The middle-aged woman's face was pale. She gave a look to a person next to her, then nodded slightly to Soren and said, "Thank you, adventurer. If it weren't for you, we wouldn't have found someone who had fallen to this point so quickly." She led Soren to the temple, and the guard next to her dragged the young man away. The sheriff's face was gloomy for a while, then he followed them and kicked the young man hard. Since someone had fallen to the evil god's side, there must be more than one. There were actually followers of evil gods here, but as the sheriff he didn't know anything about it. This would definitely cause his prestige to plummet. The Temple of Agriculture. There was a fountain in front of the shrine, and there were pools on all 4 sides. There were also plants planted there and many pictures were carved on the walls. In the center was the statue of a beautiful and refined goddess. She had a gentle smile on her face, and her arms were spread out as if she was hugging something. There was a faint light inside the shrine. This was a place that was enveloped by divine power. It seemed that people often held sacrificial ceremonies here. The goddess of agriculture was a powerful goddess, and her temple was covered by more power than many other gods. The middle-aged woman asked someone to bring a glass of water, then raised her hand and made an inviting gesture. Soren glanced around and saw the statues of the goddess of the river and the goddess of the lake in the side hall. The fields needed water to irrigate, and these 2 weak gods were the most important gods of the goddess of agriculture. The middle-aged woman looked at him and smiled. "There should be news coming soon. I'm very grateful for your help. If you need, I can arrange for your accommodation. You look like you've been traveling for a long time. Maybe you need a good rest here." Soren nodded slightly and took a sip of the water. The water had a hint of sweetness. This was the raw material of the temple's holy water. The water was purified by divine power when it passed through the temple. The foundation of a temple was the accumulation of hundreds of years. The sheriff didn't let them wait too long, but the news he brought was not good. He walked in with a gloomy face, bowed slightly and said, "Pastor Tina." No matter how we interrogated him, he wouldn't speak. He just kept cursing us. I think his mind has been controlled by the evil god. The middle-aged pastor's face instantly turned gloomy. She glanced coldly at the sheriff in front of her and said slowly, "I only care about the results. I don't want to hear your incompetent excuses." The sheriff's face suddenly turned pale. He wanted to refute but didn't dare to speak. The sheriff was not a noble. He was just an elected administrator. His status was not higher than a knight, let alone an abbot of a temple. Soren frowned and stood up. He said slowly, "Let me do it." The Maiden of Pain is also the goddess of torture. Her believers have some special abilities after the ceremony. Many cruel tortures can't destroy their minds. If there is no special means, there is no way to make them speak through normal torture. The middle-aged woman nodded and immediately said, "Thank you, sir. When we get rid of this group of fallen, the temple will definitely reward you." You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.